Primeval, Into the Darkness. My name is Douglas Winter, and these are the stories of Primeval. The Pool by Whitley Strieber and Jack Cady's By Reason of Darkness. Each story is read by Michael Murphy. A house in the country, a father and his beloved son. It is a night of discovery and a deadly communion, as Whitley Strieber takes us deep into the darkness of the pool.
That night I woke up before I had stopped dreaming. I seemed to be running through a forest, dark and so wound with paths that it might as well have been pathless. At the same time, I knew that I was lying flat on my bed. As I struggled to consciousness, it felt as if the entire top of my head were open and some sort of wind roaring through the exposed core of my brain. I heard a voice scream out, "I'm being caught inside a body!" And then I was fully awake. I lay there feeling sick and drained, and the thought came to me that our notion of the spirit world may be only partly right. There may be such a world, but the spirits that inhabit it are no longer those of mankind. I wondered then if there might not have been a war in the other world, and if our mothers and fathers have been displaced. What if bandits have mounted the ramparts of the dead? Would this then account for the hunger that many of us now have for death? That we have such a hunger cannot be denied. Look at the eagerness with which we manufacture engines of destruction. Or take the matter of the environment. The atmosphere is dying. This is more than abundantly clear. And yet we're eager to listen to those who tell us to wait. What compels them to lie, or the rest of us to listen, except a hunger for extinction? But this story is not about general extinction. It's not even about my own extinction, although I must admit that I hope as much as the next man for death. It's about a little boy and a black, black pool. That very word, pool, is at the center of my story. Pool. I won't bother you with the etymology. I'm not a pedant. But pool. Pool. Silver days of summer. The tweak of chlorine in the air. Clear splashes and high voices. Water voices. Pool. 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 At night, another place. Singing, yes, but a low, slow song. Now the approach of the frog, smelling water from across the teeming lawn. The frog leaps, a soft splash, and the frog swims in the limitless cool and deep. Pool. But there are no shallows in our pool. And the frogs can't survive in deep water. For a frog, the pool is a place of torture and death. So the water sang sweetly while we slept, dreaming our dreams. After hours and hours of blank struggle, the frog died, deep in the embrace of that which it had loved. The pool is so quiet, so dark. I woke up that night disturbed, perhaps, by the setting of the moon, or the scream of the cicada being torn apart by a bat. An absolute terror enveloped me. My heart thundered. I lay rigid in our bed, sick with woe. Then I heard, very faintly, a shuffle of water. It came from the deck, from the pool. At first I thought it was another frog, not worth my attention until morning. Then there was another splash, this one more articulate. I sat up. Could somebody be swimming there in the middle of the night? Maybe some kids from town? I got up, slipped on my house shoes, and tucked my little .22 pistol into the pocket of my robe. As an afterthought, I grabbed the flashlight. I went downstairs and moved across the living room toward the door that leads out to the deck. I opened that door as softly as I could and stepped out into the starry night. The air was twinkling with lightning bugs. The heavens were rich with stars. Before me spread the black surface of the pool. It was not still. I saw no dark frogs struggling. Instead, there was a subtle confusion of ripples, Then I saw in the starlight a pale body beneath the water. I was stunned at this small flesh. Only the three of us lived here, and surely my son was asleep in his bed. My son of the blonde laughter. My brilliant little boy. Dad, if space is nothing and the universe has an end, then what's on the other side? What's the other side of nothing? Dad, we don't see reality, we see shadows. Reality's too bright for our eyes. Dad, I'm glad you all had me. I love to be alive so I can think. I hurled the flashlight to one side, the gun to the other, and leapt into the water. Immediately the pool closed around me, bubbles churning. I came to the surface, swimming madly toward that white shadow. Then I had him. I felt him in my arms, my boy, and I dragged him to the surface. He's not a swimmer. He doesn't like the water. He always uses his life vest in the pool, always. I slogged out of the water with his limp, cool body in my arms and laid him gently on the decking. My mind rushed with life-saving maneuvers. He was so little, so frail. I could only try mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I bent down, covered his mouth with mine, and held his nose. When I blew, he at once coughed and gasped. Then he squirmed away, gagging and belching. Like some kind of dream creature, he was standing up, my son, naked in the night. His eyes bore down upon me, dark as the pool itself. Then in a low, harsh voice, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him, he said, "Get out of here. Go back to bed." "Eddie, you heard me." He stomped his foot, and I saw his tiny penis bob with the impact. His fists were clenched, his arms hanging straight down beside him. Again his voice was low and menacing. "Daddy, get out of here." "Ed, put on your life jacket. I'll go if you put on your life jacket and zip it up." As I talked, I resolved that I would not move an inch until he did it. Not an inch. If you're a parent, you can easily imagine how I felt. I loved my child with a desperate fervor. I was abandoned to him, frankly. And this was not only because of the wonder of his mind and the supple beauty of his form. It was simply because he was a human child. Before he was born, I didn't know how I would feel about him. Then he came forth, and the nurse laid him in my arms, and at once and forever I belonged to that child. My mind turned and twisted in confusion as I stood staring at him. How could it be that a 9-year-old boy would go swimming alone in the middle of the night, especially one who so disliked and distrusted the water? Why was he here? What was he doing? I wanted him to live. "We'll swim first thing in the morning," I said. "It won't be long." He was backing away from me so slowly that I didn't realize at first that he had come to the edge of the deck, where the balustrade separates it from the woods. With a swift, cocked movement, he crossed the balustrade. The barrier was now between us, the woods behind him. These are magnificent woods, deep and huge and complicated. 80 acres of them belong to me. They abut another 50,000 acres that are owned by the Palisades Water Control District. There are thousands of 100-foot-plus trees in the woods. They haven't been logged in over a century. Sometimes at night there are sounds of movement there, great and quick, and the rangers say that there's an enormous and cunning old bear. "Ed, come on back. I'll cuddle you. I'll rub your forehead." "We have to die. We're needed. If we don't kill ourselves, they'll kill us with the weather. The battle is waiting." My mind did not really grasp what he said. It seemed like gibberish, and I told him so. "You're old. Your mind is covered with scales. Mine isn't. I can hear the call." I pleaded with him to come in. "You've seen too many horror films this summer. You're upset. You've had a bad dream. Please." Could a 9-year-old somehow get drugs? What if my son had taken LSD? "It's okay, Dad. I just want to swim a bit longer. I want a little more time in the water. I'm hot." "If you want to go in the water, why did you get into the woods?" "You might not let me swim in the pool. So I'll go to the lake." I was terrified by that statement. The lake is a weedy slough dammed by snakes and mosquitoes. Its shores full of quicksand pockets. It's also deep. And in its solemn fathoms there are rocks and springs and sucking caves. No fish live there. And its banks at night are silent. I could imagine him speeding through the woods, slipping between the trees and through the runs of brush, his sweet, pale body far faster than I could ever be. Even if I ran my hardest, he would have easily 15 or 20 minutes at the lake before I arrived. That would be time enough to die. By the simplest act of crossing the fence, my son had maneuvered me into a hopeless position. I backed up. "No, Eddie, I'll let you use the pool." Warily, he returned from across the fence. He moved toward the water, and as he did, I got a clear glimpse of his face. His expression was so rich with terror, he was in a kind of ecstasy, that my impulse was to reach out and hug him to me and take him into the safety of the house. I realized then that we were out on the extreme edge. My son had gone beyond what we know as human experience. He was entering another world, and the gates of that world were in the water of the night pool. I babbled, "Come on inside, I'll make cocoa. I'll fix pancakes, I'll fry bacon." He moved into the pool like a girl, his body undulant and lazy. The water barely sloshed as he struck out. His head ducked. I could see his arms and legs working frantically. Then he went still, and his head disappeared. I could see him dropping into the blackness. It was as if my fascination had overcome all my stronger instincts. I felt hypnotized, welded to the spot, even when I saw a single huge bubble choke to the surface. At that moment, the first morning bird started to sing. It was a warbler, and its voice was so perfectly sharp and clear that it cut my bonds as surely as a knife. Once again, I jumped into the water. But this time my son returned to the surface of his own accord. He choked and churned the water with his arms, and he did not resist my rescue. But when we were out of the water, he cursed me with his slight boy's voice. "Damn you, Daddy, you broke my concentration. Learning to swim is hard." Learning to swim was a more appropriate euphemism for suicide than I possibly could have known. We went inside together. I wrapped him in his white terry-cloth robe and held him. It feels so good to hold your child. There's nothing in this world to compare with it. As I hugged him and felt his leaf-thin body and his beating heart, I watched through the door of that gleaming pool. There was still a slight movement, and then there was a splash. Another frog had begun the intricate struggle that led to death. My boy started to squirm. I had to command my arms to release their hold on him, but I did release him. "I think I'd like a little brandy," he said. And then I knew why the cognac seemed to be going slightly faster than it should. I hesitated but a moment, then poured us both snifters. His was very small, mine very large. As I sipped, I watched my son drink, jerking back at the sharpness of the fumes. "I always put it in a regular glass. I don't like the way it smells." "How long have you been coming down here in the night and drinking brandy?" "Are you sure you want to know?" His voice was too even. It sounded dangerous. I nodded, though. Behind me, the refrigerator clicked on, filling the shadowy kitchen with its low, drumming roar. "I started coming down to be alone when I was about 4. I usually sit and think for an hour or two, then I have a little tiny bit of brandy and go to bed." A bolt went through me. I felt awful. I'd been such a blind fool. All of his life I'd been failing him. "I'm not like you. I love you, but I'm not like you. Your mind has an end. It's got a door, and the door's closed. I was born without a door. When I turn my attention to my own thoughts, it's different from the way it is with you. You go inside something to think. I go outside. Your mind is a nice, neat room. Mine's like the sky." The room seemed horribly cold, the hum of the refrigerator almost enslaving. My little boy leaned against the kitchen counter in his fluffy robe, contemplating the contents of his glass, and I no longer saw him as my little boy. It was as if he'd already died. I grew dizzy. I heard the howl of angels. I struggled to one of the dinette chairs and sank down. "Dad, will you rub my head? I'd like to go to bed and have you rub my head." I went into his room with him, and he took off his robe and tossed it on the spare bed, then put on his pajamas. They were in a heap on the floor. I sat on his bedside through thousands of story times, through the sicknesses and sweats of childhood. Here we read the winter noisy book easily 200 times, taking turns making the sounds. Hiss for snow, crack for the ice, woo-hoo for the lonely foghorn out in the bay. And here we read Huckleberry Finn and Wee Willie Winkie, and a child awakens and goes out, and whatever first that child sees, that thing he becomes. And trailing clouds of glory do we come. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. He lay suddenly innocent beside me, sticks beneath a night warm sheet. The only thing that said he was conscious was the gleam of his Donald Duck nightlight in his eyes. My mind began to weave a normal hour around the black, surreal wound of the pool. In a moment we had returned to our familiar roles of wise lord and gaping disciple. The clock in the front hall tolled 4, and a whippoorwill sang through the last of the night. I rubbed his cool forehead and was glad when the dawn wind rose and fluttered the curtains. My fear for him was too great to allow me to leave. I sat sentinel at his bedside. When he was born, they put him in my arms. The nurse said, "Go ahead, you can hold him." "I might drop him," I said. When he was 7, he said, "You were afraid you'd drop me when I was born." He was on the volleyball team at school, and he played with utter abandon. But his voice was not that of a competitor, not really. I could hear it when he shouted. In his cries there was an edge of design. Once he said, "God needs us as bad as we need God. If we die, God will grieve forever. We are God's dream." Jenny and I must have been terribly imperceptive parents not to have seen the relationship between that statement and the pool. But we did not see it. Instead, we luxuriated in self-congratulation. He's so brilliant, and yet he's so happy. Thank God we have respect for his genius. We aren't afraid of it. 2 strutting baboons we were, before the quiet, waiting waters of the pool. Morning came suddenly, all bright and rioting with birds. When I drove him off to day camp, he chattered amiably about his part in the play to be shown to the parents at the end of the week. "I wanted to play the Raven, but I ended up being Poe. You think I look like Poe? I don't look a thing like Poe. If I look like any poet, it's Robert Browning, at least from the front. I've noticed Swinburne in the profile." He was a perfectly fine-looking boy. Swinburne was so weak-chinned and pop-eyed the British Army refused to let him join for fear of how absurd he would look in that beloved uniform. "You'll be a great Poe. Janet Cadeau is the Raven, my Raven." On the way home, I could think of nothing but a thorough and complete search of his room. I was beside myself. To hell with our rules of family privacy, I had to intervene. My little boy, my brilliant little star, was drowning. And if he died, I resolved then and there that I would follow him. I dashed along in our worn Celica, my mouth dry with terror. I remembered the pool, how still and dark it was, and that pale, lithe body gleaming beneath the surface. You could see stars in the water. For some reason, it did not occur to me to tell Jenny what had happened. I guess that I wanted to cling a little longer to the illusion that all was well, and silence would help me do it. When I pulled into our driveway, I could hear the bell on St. Peter's Church tolling the hour of 10, its deep clang mingling with the striking of our clock. The dryer blew gently into the driveway, filling the air with a faint perfume of clean clothes. Jenny was sitting on the deck reading the paper. Her usual mug of coffee was at hand. She waved easily, her welcoming voice echoing across the dew-bright lawn. I wanted to cry, but instead I went to Eddie's room. What a stupid man I am. I was looking for drugs. My mind reviewed the children he knew. Sullen, thieving Sean, maybe. Sweet Hillary? Never. Paul, sophisticated beyond his years. Of course. There's the worm in the woodpile. I did not find drugs, nor paraphernalia, nor anything even remotely connected with such matters. Instead, I found a little homemade radio. At least I thought it was a radio. It was nothing but a few resistors strung together on a piece of perforated board. They were switched to a lithium battery. I knew it must be a radio because of the crystal. When I flipped the lamp switch that had been dropped into the circuit, I had an odd experience. A sort of light flashed between my eyes. I decided that it must be the tension. Afterward, I felt that somebody was looking at me. I pleaded sick, stayed away from the office. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what in the world was wrong with my boy. Jenny picked him up, thank God. While she was gone, I slept. And when I slept, I dreamed of a gray desert. Beyond it waited a red kingdom wreathed in clouds. As I looked at those clouds, there came to me an ache of nostalgia. I could hear people singing, as if in fields, marching off to the war. And there stole into my mind an immense sadness. I woke up suddenly and was stunned to find that it was long past midnight. I could smell the pool. I hungered to swim, to dive down deep into the waters, to sink away into the silence. It was as if I were compelled by some hypnosis to get up and throw off my pajamas and go swimming. But when I got to the pool, I saw that I was too late. The police, when they came, brought bustle and light. But no light could affect Jenny, who was so broken by the death of her only child that she grieves even now. She will lean her head against the edge of her chair and stare off into space for hours. I cannot tell her of the voices I hear singing, nor of the glowing light of the kingdom, nor of the faces that look up at me from the pool's water, of the boy who stole our hearts, and all that army that stands behind him, of the waiting and the dead.
Beyond the veil of deep water and the shadows of the night, walk with me now into another darkness that only few have seen, the darkness of combat. If war is hell, then how do we define its aftermath? Jack Cady reminds us that soldiers live and dream and die by reason of darkness.
Now the corpses are decayed, not into dust, but have become one with the fertile and well-watered soil of the valleys. The open sun illuminates the forests, and it pries into those dark places where moss softens the tread of men and beasts. Even the skeletons, one supposes, have become soil, although no doubt a polished white fragment is still occasionally washed from the hills, the bone glowing spectral and jewel-like in a setting of thick foliage. Villages are rebuilt, rice paddies are tended. If ghosts walk that wet land, and ghosts always have, perhaps we who did so much killing there are still remembered. The living try to forget. We came in landing craft and airplanes and helicopters, and we breathed the hot screams of war. We left as if blown by a cold exhalation. A sigh, a murmur from the congregated dead. You ask which war? It makes no difference. They're all the same. Only the terrain differs. Every few years there's an improvement in weapons. There's never an improvement in illusions. When I received the phone call from Bjorn North, I was amazed to find that I still had illusions. North lived in a small town on the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington State. He fished some of the time, drank most of the time, and when the fishing was bad, he ran drugs in a small way. I called the Blackbird, he said. Blackbird's coming. I want you both here. The Blackbird's insane, I said. He isn't just Asiatic the way we may be. The bird is genuinely insane. There's a reason for the Blackbird's insanity, and we both knew it. This is more than a reunion, I said into the phone. What do you want? I have to make a judgment call, North said. And only you and the Blackbird will understand it. North's voice cracked, whispered, lingered over syllables like a man hesitating as he fumbled in a foreign language. I could imagine him hunched inside a phone booth overlooking a harbor shrouded in evening fog. It's a dark, wet land in which he lived. North was as tall as I am, but without the balding head and hooked nose. His long legs would swell the seams of his pants at the shanks. His narrow chest would seem dubbed onto the body of a wrestler, and above it would ride his equally narrow and Scandinavian face, like a new moon with whitish blonde hair. Are you drinking? When he was drinking, he had a bad habit of laughing. A white face turned red, a red mouth grotesque. Obscenity often amused him. Not enough, he said. If you mean am I sober, the answer is I'm afraid to get drunk. The phone connection carried an echo once muddled and faint. Stay sober. Stay dry for 2 days. It'll take me that long to get there. I paused. North was not fundamentally a liar, although there had probably never been such a thing as a completely truthful sailor. What are you afraid of? I asked. His voice was a guarded whisper, like a man dredging a secret from a deep well. I'm afraid there's no safe place to die. War is normal. If it were not, we'd stop having so many of them. One problem with war is that the men who fight are generally voiceless. Even if they find their voices, no one listens. No one can afford to listen. When the war is over, the men who survive put on civilian clothes and disappear into the crowd. Occasionally, one of them camps alongside a freeway with a rifle, or he tosses his girlfriend from a 7-story window, or he bunkers up and dies in a firefight with the police. Newspapers report the event. People shake their heads and say, my, and good God. They're surprised, but the real surprise is not that a few do it, but that thousands do not. A war produces corpses, but it doesn't bury them. At least it doesn't bury them deep. I suspected that North's corpses were coming back to greet him, for we all have a string of spirits trailing at our back. They're like the anchoring tail of an enormous kite. If you handle them with respect, they only whisper a little bit sometimes, and the trail behind you is faded and vague. Handle them wrong, as North perhaps was finding out, the spirits turn from the mist to the dark smoke of napalm. Are you dying? I asked him. Not right away, North said. At least if I can help it. I will not help you kill yourself. I'm no longer tuned to it, even to help a friend. He was shocked. Not because of what he'd heard, but because I'd spotted a weakness he tried to conceal. I want to live, he said. If I need killing, I'll ask the Blackbird. It was then that I discovered I still had illusions. A friend was in need. Maybe it was possible to help. Sit tight, I told him. 48 hours. It was August, a droning time in my San Francisco law office. The place could run without me for a week. My secretary is a private person. She asked only essential questions. Miss Molly is a 45-year-old spinster in a day when spinsters are supposed to be extinct. She didn't mean for it to be that way. Jews have close-knit families, I know because I come from one. Miss Molly's mother died young. She was the youngest daughter. Her career was first housekeeper, now nurse to her aged father. The Blackbird, she said. It sounds like bad television. That's how it sounds, I told her. The smart Jew lawyer, the Nordic fisherman, and the King Kong Negro. But for once you're wrong. The bird is small. He even looks like a bird. Albert Byrd is so black that he seems pure African. He could kill Miss Molly while he was shaking her hand. She would be dead before the smile of greeting left her face. But he's not a highly trained killer. The blackbird simply has a talent. "This is real," she said as she packed a folder of legal work in my briefcase. "Just in case things get unreal." The odds on my killing again seemed long. Not impossible. When I returned from war, it was to discover that when men hate their lives or cannot come to terms with them, they must fight against killing those who are familiar or loved. It took a long time to learn. My wife divorced me largely, I think, because she feared the forces she sensed lying behind my tenderness. At any rate, wives are in danger, and secretaries. When the men do not understand what drives them, the wives and secretaries are in awful danger. Miss Molly is as rare as a dinosaur. It would be a crime to throw the last dinosaur from this 30-story building. Sometimes the men kill each other too, and for those same reasons of love. But more of that later. "I believe," she said as I packed a pistol in the briefcase, "I'm supposed to remind you to save the last round for yourself." She was not being sarcastic, exactly. She was not being humorous because she was not smiling. She's small, dark-haired, unsmiling, a cynic but not bitter. I like her for her toughness. Miss Molly does not ask for sympathy and does not give it in matters short of a death in the family. She knows what sort of monster she works beside. Maybe she thinks of me as the last dinosaur. The route from San Francisco wound past the outskirts of Chinatown. Many-colored banners displayed the breeze. Tourists. Shops selling imitation jade, bamboo, rice paper, tea, carp. All of it a facade. Or maybe not. Opium, sweatshops, money, smuggling of every commodity, especially illegal immigrant Chinese. We fight war after war in the Orient. The Orient always wins. It absorbs, takes us over. We disappear into its enormous yawn. Bad television? The blackbird's insanity makes him unable to lie. It makes him consult with horses, pigs, dogs, finches. Long conversations. He hears their voices. Insanity causes his celibacy. He fears children. Or rather, he fears fathering them. Were a daughter or granddaughter to climb on his knee and ask him what he did in the war, the blackbird would say, "I killed little girls just like you. They got in the way." But to Molly, it can only seem like bad television. She doesn't know the bird, although she knows some of the rest of us. The rest of us do not suffer the blackbird's affliction. The rest of us know how to lie. If my daughter asked what I did in the war, the answer would be, "I sat in the CIC on a destroyer eating donuts and fired rockets." I would not tell her those rockets were fired at quadrants on a grid. A list of quadrants chosen by a computer programmed to the probability of enemy movements. I would not tell her it was impossible to know what was in each quadrant. An enemy camp, a marketplace, a convent, a grade school. I would say nothing about those days in the jungle with North and the blackbird. San Francisco to Seattle is a hard day's drive if you take the freeway. I took the coast route, which is interminably slow. A 2-day drive. It was a matter of self-protection, a matter of preparation. The mind is not always so strong and exact as we like to believe. I was driving toward some dark hysteria, perhaps toward a dying friend. The very land toward which the car pointed is a land of mist, of darkness, a land of sullen seas and black forests, a land of Chinese ghosts, Indian ghosts, and white fear. Rain covers those forests. Moss grows as carpets on the trunks of trees. Dark stone beaches are whipped by wind, by surf, by the pressing tides that lap the land like an enormous beast. A cat, perhaps, or something not so agile, something ancient, geologic, a beast blinking only once while a century passes. Above San Francisco in late August, the California hills were burned. The coast was decorated, enameled road signs, camper trucks, sports cars. Pretty girls wore skimpy clothing and on the beaches they sometimes wore no clothing at all. Children were like skinny flashes of light, or like small anchors beneath bird and dragon kites pushed by the coastal breeze. They were momentarily like spirits, and there's something particularly horrible in the idea of ghosts walking at high noon and chewing hot dogs. Gulls squawked, glided, flapped, gathered popcorn, bread crusts. The coast was a spectrum of life and movement. Beaches appear one way when you're standing on them thinking of baseball and sex and sunshine. They carry a different tone when you stand on a steel deck, approaching from seaward. Just below Mendocino, color began to drain from the beaches and return to the land. The coastal fog rolled across the town, across inlets and roads. It lay like a chill thought that comprehended the glistening hoods of cars, the tall windmills of Mendocino, then distilled as raindrops in the corners of windowsills. It coated plastic menus outside restaurants, and it dimmed streetlights to luminous discs in the late afternoon. The fog seemed a well-tailored recollection for a man on a journey toward the dead. The blackbird wears a watch on each wrist. One is a Mickey Mouse watch, a black mouse wearing white gloves, a mouse trapped in timeless semaphores that measures seconds, days, and years. On his other wrist, the blackbird wears a watch made for combat. It's precise and nearly indestructible. He began wearing the watches to cover the scars on his wrists where he cut them after he killed the sympathizer Corporal Kim. These days, the blackbird wears the watches for other reasons. North and the blackbird went ashore in the bright white of dawn. Our harebrained executive officer had detailed them to the beach with cases of canned peaches, boxes of phosphorus grenades, 3 cases of ice cream mix, 40 canned hams, tins of Dutch cheese, foil packets containing ketchup and honey, 16 bottles of whiskey, 20 cases of beer, boxes of laxative, 50 pounds of apples, 16 gallons of gray enamel, 4 reams of U.S. Navy stationery, an enormous cooking pot, 20 pairs of Arctic boots, a hand-operated adding machine, a huge world globe on an elaborately carved mahogany stand, a case of 10-gauge shotgun shells, 8 dozen assorted braziers. No one ever figured out how those ended up in a supply room of a destroyer. Cartons of menthol cigarettes, cases of aspirin, a bamboo birdcage, 20 gross of carpenter's pencils, and I do not recall the rest. The blackbird still has the original manifest. He claims it now hangs in a frame on his bedroom wall. In war, no one knows why anyone else does anything. The most astounding and incoherent things occur with slim reason. Maybe the exec was trying to be helpful to a brother officer in the army. Maybe he was paying off a gambling debt. Maybe the supply officer was trying to dump inventory he didn't want or couldn't account for. At any rate, the cargo was destined for an army command area 20 miles into the interior. North and the blackbird got hold of a truck, loaded the stuff after reserving the whiskey for trading purposes, and headed inland while drinking beer. It was their initial encounter with the jungle. At first, they drove 20 miles an hour. The dirt tracks, which passed for a road, wound beneath dripping, sweetly rotten-smelling leaves. The sun was blocked by enormous trees. The road became more and more narrow. They suspected they had gotten the wrong directions, that they were on a road leading to nowhere. A narrow ribbon of light ran above the road. 10 miles into the interior, the tracks began to dwindle away. They feared they would no longer be able to go forward, and there was no space to turn around. They were inching ahead in low gear. The blackbird recalls that he worried he might not stand the silence and the claustrophobic grasp of the jungle. They were captured by the U.S. Marines. The whole affair seemed a burlesque, a mouse show, a convocation orchestrated and spoken by clowns. The Marines were desperate men, but men strangely efficient and polite. They were not fools. That was proven because they were still alive. They were combat-ridden. Their faces were gaunt, burned with the sun, blackened with soot. The blackbird at first had trouble discovering which of them were white. Their faces seemed to exist only for the purpose of raising crops of hair. All of them had beards that were chopped short by knives. Beards and mustaches existed only as circling frames for teeth. The men spoke between their teeth or in whispers. North remembered their seriousness and efficiency. He recalled that he had the choice of giving up the load and not dying, or giving up the load after he died. He felt vaguely violated. After all, the stolen whiskey was his by right. Now it was being taken from him. Imagine them there. North, a bosun's mate, and the Blackbird, a storekeeper. Two sailors accustomed to seeing death fall from the air, shells exploding on distant shores, death painting the slickness of blood across steel. Imagine them standing among crazed men in a mist-laden jungle where death poked its snout through foliage, where blood became only a dark and soaking comment in the soil. The Marines once had been a full company. Now they amounted to a platoon, although they had native sympathizers with them. One sympathizer was little more than a boy. His nearly unpronounceable name had been distorted to Sydney, then to Sidri. Sidri was a tiny fellow. When he stood beside the Blackbird, even the Blackbird seemed a full-sized man. The Marines unloaded the truck. What they did not want, they stacked to one side. North figured he and Blackbird would be left with the ketchup and the gray paint and the Arctic boots. Until the last moment, neither North nor Blackbird had the least intimation that before the affair was over, they would walk 300 miles through the jungle as they carried canned peaches and the rifles of dead men. The Blackbird vividly remembers the enemy attack. He remembers it in slow motion. He recalls watching the boy's face. Actually, he was watching Sidri's mouth. The Blackbird was having trouble understanding the sympathizer's version of English. Blackbird watched the lips moving, listened carefully, was aware in a vague way of a growing stack of canned goods beside the skinny road. Then the boy's face disappeared. A bullet entered the back of the skull and exploded. The Blackbird found himself carefully listening for a voice to continue from that faceless skull. He saw the inner bone of the skull. He was vaguely aware that his own face was covered with soft matter and liquid. To this day, he swears that he stood there for 2 minutes listening for jumbled language to come pouring from the skull of a standing corpse. He did not, of course. It was a matter of a second, perhaps no more. The sympathizer, Corporal Kim, dived forward and knocked the Blackbird to the road. They both rolled behind a small fortress of canned peaches. Up until that point, the Blackbird had not heard a single unusual sound. Once on the ground, he heard gunfire. An enemy patrol lay in ambush. The history of war contains thousands of futile and desperate battles fought over inconceivably stupid objectives. This battle in the jungle was as desperate as any battle ever waged, and it was between men who were made for ham and cheese and peaches. When the firefight was over, not one carton had been hit. The Blackbird swears he was safer behind that narrow stack of canned goods than at any other time in his life. What caused the attack? The question haunted North and the Blackbird. Why would a single squad on patrol, even owning the element of surprise, take such a desperate chance? That squad attacking a platoon of veterans in the game of killing. The attackers were not starving. North saw whitish fat peeled away from a gut wound opened by a fragmentation grenade. The enemy belly pulsed, digesting, as the man died. The Marines were not starving. The enemy was not starving. And yet somehow, and North could never even speak of this, somehow the root of the battle was an enormous hunger. These Marines carried no esprit de corps. Such foolishness was good enough in bars and on drill fields, not so good in a jungle. Instead, they carried a rough honesty. They regarded North and the Blackbird as supercargo, as men of inexperience who would shortly die. Until the time when they would be killed, the two sailors could serve as carriers. The Marines did not actually press the Blackbird and North into service. They simply pointed out that the truck radiator sported a bullet hole. They encouraged the Blackbird and North to discuss the matter. The two men did this as the Marines buried the boy, Sidri, in a shallow grave. The Bird and North could walk 10 miles along the road that might sprout an enemy patrol, or they could walk with a platoon of killers while carrying goods. North recalled being furious about the choice. After all, they were supposed to be in a secured zone. They'd been so certain of their safety that they left their helmets in the barge when they came ashore. They were nearly weaponless. North carried an antiquated .45 automatic. The Blackbird, who was raised on the streets of Philadelphia, did not waste his time in anger. He foraged among the enemy dead for helmets and rifles. Then he made one of those obscure but somehow significant gestures for which he would become notorious. The blackbird stood the huge globe in the middle of the road. It rested on its gorgeously carved mahogany stand. The narrow band of sunlight above the road highlighted the reliefs of the globe, sunlight and shadow, colored continents, nations, and seas. The blackbird put his white hat on the globe. North recalled his last sight of that road as the platoon faded into the jungle. A fresh grave lay beneath dripping branches, and above it a world globe wearing a sailor's white hat stood in silent benediction. No one from our ship saw them for months. I was the one who found them. By that time, it was too late. I can't explain the exact difference between memory and recollection. Memory is something a person consciously tries for, while recollection more or less comes unbidden. But with recollection, it seems you chew a little longer, maybe work harder at understanding what pushed it into your mind. It's like analyzing a dream. I thought of the problem as I drove toward Bjorn North and his demons, and as the narrow California road turned into a narrow Oregon road. I spent the night in a gloomy beach motel on the Oregon coast. It was one of those places where the walls are in need of washing, but where antiseptic light floods the toilet seat and gives the illusion that foul diseases are being flooded away. A narrow paper strip across the seat brags of sanitation. Another problem with war is that men in combat assume patterns that make the civilized world ridiculous. When, for example, the main disease is bullets, no one going to a whorehouse worries about using prophylactics. Then the men return to a sanitary world, where tobacco and alcohol and drugs are supposed to be supplanted by antiseptics and good manners. One never meets good manners in battle, although one occasionally meets compassion. Men find it hard to make the switch from mortar fire to sanitary toilets. In the jungle, you're always surrounded. So is the enemy. There's no clear demarcation. It's a deadly game of hide and seek where the enemy will never appear before your guns. The enemy will be to one side or at your back. Day after day, week after week, surrounded. Black men and white men develop cautious patterns of insanity, as do Orientals. The encirclement continues when the war is over. The sanitary people, the ones who started the war in the first place, insist you join their illusions. Work hard. Get ahead. Don't kill anybody. Find some way to look at children and not imagine burned flesh, empty eye sockets. The antiseptic people insist that you be nice to the waiter who stiffs you for $1. They ask that you think kindly of the politicians who even now plan a war to kill your sons. Because they say, we're all in this together, my friend. Think kindly thoughts and love us. I fight back by wielding the law. It makes a little sense to be a lawyer. Not much else does. I'm a good lawyer because I fired rockets. Because I've spent 2 months in the jungle. The Marines in that platoon were outlaws. In military terms, those Marines were operating with independence. Their commander back at Group could never be certain of what they would do. They were roving, honed, horribly efficient. Their mission was to protect the perimeter of that large army camp. In practical terms, they walked and killed. They were phantoms fading through the jungle. Phantoms turning to the sudden heat of amazing flame when they encountered resistance. They were survivors because they killed on the basis of probability. If an old native had the bad luck to see them as they crossed the road, the old native was shot. Maybe he would have said nothing about their location. The Marines stayed alive because they always tilted the probability in their favor. They were statistical killers, more easily and intimately understandable than computers that fired rockets. The Blackbird and North were immersed in that destructive element. If the Marines first regarded them as supercargo, Blackbird and North did not. They understood that if they were to survive, they would have to learn fast. The Blackbird learned right away. By the time I found those Marines, the Blackbird and North had seen a variety of things, done a variety of things more. It happened this way, one more part of the madness. Our destroyer ran out of rockets. Incredible. No one had paid attention to my inventory reports. The ship mounted 2 banks of pom-poms that would depress only far enough to take the top off a mountain at a 4-mile range. We mounted some old heat-seeking missiles, which any attack pilot old enough to shave could avoid by dropping a few flares. We had plenty of depth charges, although the enemy had no submarines. In other words, the ship was defenseless. There was lots of maple syrup in the pantry, jugs of whiskey in the captain's quarters, but by God, there were no more rockets. The ship withdrew, hunting for a tender, a mothership. Before it withdrew, the same idiot executive officer put me on the beach. "You caused this," he said. "You made us run out of rockets. No rockets, no gunnery officer." He was a man with Yankee eyes and cheeks like marinated beef steeped in booze and tropical sun. A great leader of men. A great navigator, with slumped shoulders and a great belly and a great butt. He was the only naval officer in history who ever crashed a dock while pulling away from it. "File charges," I told him. He knew and I knew that if he could get me killed, there would never be an inquiry. No one would ever ask why a destroyer had steamed away from an action because it was defenseless. "Bring them sailors back," he said, "and the captain will be happy." He was pleased. "If you don't come back, the exec will be happier." I went ashore, and I was afraid. Rumors were coming back to the ship of 2 sailors crazier than most Marines. Each of the men had shown up once at that large army base. They came in a captured truck. They drew supplies for that outlaw platoon. The white sailor was a jolt of savage fear. He arrived unaccompanied, and he wore rotten-smelling scalp locks stitched to his shirt. He eventually went on an alcoholic binge and tore a whorehouse to pieces after bedding every woman in the place. That, of course, was not unusual. The unusual event happened before the drinking began. The white sailor had become Asiatic, but worse than most. Usually men just mumble through convenient Oriental customs, or play at being Oriental. This sailor was sardonic. His laughter was cruel. His large teeth and flushed face were like a caricatured troll before a carnival funhouse. Before he began drinking, he sat beside a Buddhist monk for 3 hours, sitting in what seemed complete and reverent silence. Then he stood, bowed, and shot the unsurprised, undismayed monk in the face with a .45 pistol. He left town through crowded streets and at high speed. He was indifferent to screams and thumps and rag-like rolling bodies. It was not, the rumors admitted, that the white sailor did unheard-of things. It was simply, the rumors said, that when other men did such things, they usually had some excuse, no matter how flimsy. This sailor, whose name was North, was like an animal snarling above a carcass. He seemed pressed by fear that there would be a shortage of bodies, of women, of whiskey. A shortage, in fact, of omnipotent illusions that galloped through the corridors of a mind gone wild. But it was the black sailor who gave pause to even the most seasoned men. The black sailor arrived later, driving the same truck, but accompanied by the sympathizer, Corporal Kim. The 2 men were efficient. They were quiet while drinking, unremarkable while bedding, and they drove carefully through the crowded streets. Where the white sailor sported scalp locks sewn to his shirt, the black sailor simply wore black feathers in his hair. The feathers were intermingled, stitched and braided, so the man's head was a ruffle with black. He looked like a surprised crow. The black sailor left live grenades with unbent pins as calling cards. The things were harmless enough so long as no fool pulled the pin. When he left a bar, a grenade lay on the table. When he left the depot, a grenade lay on the supply sergeant's desk. He left grenades on the beds of women. The black sailor was pleasant, even courteous, and both he and the sympathizer, Corporal Kim, seemed to think of the grenades not as tips for service, but as party favors. There was an abstract gaiety about the men that seemed to define the war as a cotillion or clambake. They were great friends. I had the bad luck to find them on the day the war heated up, the day the enemy mounted a counteroffensive. An army truck dropped me and supplies at a rendezvous point. There was a clash of helicopters above the jungle, a whip, whip, whip of rotors thumping like pulse. Along the roads, a frightened native population streamed ahead of the enemy, while overhead the helicopters hosed the jungle with rockets and gunfire. The sounds seemed gratuitous. The flames were real. The fire sprays everywhere, along roads, or absorbed in the dripping silence of the jungle. Occasionally a rocket hits the top of an enormous tree. When that happens, there's a small tear in what seems the impenetrable umbrella of the jungle. North saved my life, and not only once. I was confused, vulnerable, in the shocking push and shove of forces exploding around us. North was not particularly pleased to see me. "What the hell are you doing here?" he said. I was, after all, an officer, but we hailed from the same ship. That called upon some loyalty that still lay curled and embryonic in North's notions of righteousness. There was also this. He knew that sooner or later a court-martial was likely. It was obvious that the Marines were not holding the sailors as hostage. North may have protected me because I was a lawyer. He kept me alive as counsel for his defense. For the next 2 months, North and the Blackbird were never far from my side. We saw and did a variety of things. "As sweet as hell and hallelujah," the bird would say of those things. North remained silent. He stopped taking scalps. The 2 months were spent in retreat, circling, counterattack, retreat, and more circling. Somewhere, sitting in the stateroom of an aircraft carrier, a few admirals and generals may have known the overall situation. They probably drank together and called each other by first names. Pete, Tom, Bob. They spoke of strategy and women. We spoke only of tactics, and we called each other by any vulgarity that was convenient. Toward the end of the second month, there was hope that we would leave the jungle. The military situation steadied. It much resembled what it had been when North and the Blackbird first entered that narrow road. There were no clear lines of defense and offense. We and the enemy were once more surrounding each other. The area was declared secure. The deadly game of hide-and-seek resumed. At the time, there seemed a second reason for hope. At the time. Looking back on it, as I looked back on it during the final leg of the drive up the Washington coast, that second hopeful reason was at the root of any horror that dwelt in the dark forests of North's mind. It was a horror that lay ancient in my own mind, a horror darker than the wet fir forests of Washington, darker than the tumbling black waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The second hopeful reason was this. Our ship returned to its station with a fresh bellyful of rockets. The rockets fell in the jungle and made men fearful, but mostly the rockets wrecked the little foliage, changing the smells from rotting vegetation to the sharp scent of high explosive. Once we saw them fall on a village, saw mud rising in fire, mud changed to dust, then to flame. At the time, all I could really understand was that the computers still functioned. And then, and may all the gods there are, if there are any, protect us. One day the rockets fell in a graveyard. There were plenty of fresh graves in every graveyard of that country. The native population continued to practice its ceremonies. A part of their ritual was to erect small fences around each grave. The fences were called spirit fences. Most of them were white. Most of them were made of plain wood. The small fences contained the spirits of the dead and kept away the other, hungry spirits that flew across the world howling and weeping in their relentless and hopelessly eternal quests. Our ship's rockets took care of the spirit fences. Graves were upturned. Corpses tumbled skyward in geysers of flame. The spirits were released. To North, it was a thunderous joke. Lightning and thunder. The absurdity tickled his fancy. He laughed like a demented inquisitor. North's Protestant god was one of the Scandinavians' versions, a god consorting with Valkyries. He thought it one more fine offense against one more pagan religion. He was red-faced as he laughed, although his eyebrows were strangely white as his sun-bleached hair. Recall that North had already murdered one Buddhist monk. To the sympathizer Corporal Kim, the affair with the graveyard was another matter. All through the 2-month ordeal, Kim and the Blackbird had retained their insane gaiety. They shared food. They fought well and trekked well. They worked together like fingers on the same hand. They sent the enemy to heaven or hell with impartial joy. Kim's eyes were wide and seemed almost round. He had a small mouth. When he laughed, his mouth and eyes were like 3 flat circles of mirth across his flat face. After the business of the graveyard, Kim became morose. His eyes were heavy-lidded, and they looked towards north with an occasional flat stare. Kim no longer laughed. North laughed in defiance, but he kept his holster flap unbuckled. He was careful about the direction in which he pointed his back. Why did Kim take the rocket so seriously? Was it North's laughter? At the time, none of us knew. Perhaps those spirit fences had been Kim's symbolic bunker against reality. The fences might have had the same illusory protection as, say, the 2-inch steel plate behind which we hid on the destroyer. Neither fence nor steel plate is at all effective if viewed sanely. The problem is that no one was sane. Kim and the blackbird became even closer. They often sat in silence. What Kim confided to Blackbird was unknown, because the blackbird did not discuss it. The final killing act arrived on the heels of a miracle. It was a mindless miracle, true, a part of the great absurdity of battle, but a miracle that even the Old Testament Joshua would have praised. We were caught in high grass in the middle of fields. We were crossing those fields just after dawn. We knew the enemy was not even close. Then we were blinded by the rising sun. "It's a sellout!" Those were North's first words when the gunfire began, when everyone was hitting the deck. North yelled the words before he was fully stretched on the ground with his weapon pointed. Off to the left, a man screamed. An enemy voice yelled and laughed. North's face was as white as his eyebrows. North was right. This was not an error in command. The platoon was sold, euchred. Somebody had been consorting with the enemy. We were jammed, pinned, enfiladed. We were the same as dead men. Automatic weapons opened up from under the cover of tall grass, only grass, on our left flank. Machine guns opened up from an area of jungle that curved across the fields and toward the left side of our line. A narrow neck of trees jutted on our right, and from them machine guns began spouting. The gunfire was solid. It was actually mowing the grass. Dead men. We could attempt to retreat 200 yards across flat grassland, or we could lie pinned until the enemy brought up mortars. The machine guns searched the grass, whipped the grass. The air seemed full of flying seeds, pollen, stem heads. The weapons were working by sectors, in much the way our ship's computers worked by sectors. Our problem was that these sectors were small, and there were not many of them. North and I wiggled forward, holding grenades, trying to get in throwing distance. Stupid. Every time we moved, the grass moved. A machine gun hosed above us. The sun lay like a carpet on the grass. I remember lying with the lip of my helmet pressed against the ground, and I was suddenly smelling soil. It was almost like I could hear movement in the soil, of insects, bacteria, growing roots. Then the clang and bang of mortars began. Another man screamed, and for a few minutes he continued screaming. I recall thinking silly thoughts about the law. This is a divorce, I thought, a matter of community property. And then the miracle arrived on the heavy sound of engines. The sky was clouded with transport planes. Shadows of planes were whipping over us like shadows at a light show. It seemed that every plane owned by every air force in the world had decided to converge over those fields. There must have been enough planes that a man could step from wing to wing, walking across the sky. In less than 2 minutes, men and corpses began falling all around us. Somewhere at some army headquarters, a general had looked at a map and seen an area of fields in a zone marked secured. He ordered a low-level jump for parachute troops, a training exercise. 2,000 men dropped in about 15 minutes. 2,000 dropped into fields enfiladed by machine guns. A corpse collapsed beside us. The morning was windless. The chute billowed, then fell to cover the grass like a comforting thought. The dead eyes held more excitement than surprise. There was very little left of the thing from the chest down. The aircraft engines continued pulsing, pulsing. A living parachutist dropped on the other side of us, rolling on his back, releasing the chute and screaming. He was yelling, "Ted! Ted!" And then he was yelling, "Medic! Medic!" He tried to crawl over us in a desperate attempt to reach the dead man. "Ted'ums is dead'ums," North told him, and giggled. North was hysterical with relief. Color returned to his face. The planes thumped and droned. The shadows flickered. "Lock and load, my man," North said. "Ready on the right, ready on the left, ready on the firing line." North's hysteria clanged like mortars. He clung to the ground and listened to the cacophony of machine gun fire, the surprised screams, the curses. It was a shooting gallery, but the enemy could not shoot them all. It was just a matter of time. North lay flat. He began screaming vulgarities and jokes at the enemy. The planes droned on. "There's nothing you can do," I told the parachutist, "except to save yourself. Let the men who land behind the guns take care of it." He was a young Alaskan Indian. The physical type is easy to spot. The dark, fleshy face dropped its grief and took on fear. The boy hugged the ground. He didn't even ready his weapon. At most, it took an hour. Grenades exploded. The machine gun fire gradually dwindled. Before the last gun was silenced, we heard the thumping of helicopters. They were arriving to bring back men from a successful jump. Instead, they began the long and busy day of carrying the wounded and the dead. An incident of war. The general who ordered the action was later commended for taking out the last pockets of resistance in the area. Another incident of war. We rose from the tall grass like resurrected men, like men discarding the shrouds of their graves to stand confused and blinking in the sunlight, like men released to wander once more the streets of some unholy city. Kim and the blackbird stood, faced each other across the sunlit grass. Kim was calm, but the blackbird was shaking. Kim smiled without fear at his black face. Kim's smile was not apologetic. The blackbird murmured, whispered. Kim shrugged. His weapon was resting at his side. With his free hand, he pointed a finger at his chest, searching with the finger the exact location. Nodded. The blackbird whispered, "No." Kim smiled, insisted. The blackbird shot Kim precisely, exactly where the finger had pointed. It was over in less than 10 seconds. We had all once more hit the deck. "He ought to pay attention to where he points that thing," North complained. "He can mess around and actually kill somebody." North's voice was whining with disbelief. I said an incredibly stupid thing. "What are friends for?" We were all shocked. Kim had asked an awful thing of the blackbird, yet it was easy to understand. Kim knew it was all over for him. Half of the remnants of that platoon had already figured out that Kim was the betrayer. They had thought through our movements of the past few days, recognizing that only a scout, Kim, could have made contact with the enemy. Kim no doubt figured it better to die quickly and with dignity than to die in the way those Marines would have killed him. Why had Kim betrayed us? The blackbird knew, but he wasn't talking. The whole affair was small and private. When the men from that platoon once more stood viewing Kim's body in the grass, a few parachutists were looking our way. Then they shrugged and went about their business. One more Oriental face, one more execution. It was routine. What was not routine is that the blackbird was passing from the insanity of battle into the permanent insanity that would hold him like a bone in a wild dog's teeth. The blackbird lay beside Kim all that day. Sometimes he embraced the body, but mostly he lay beside Kim as two lovers might lie beside each other in a field. It was strangely sexual, although nothing of that sort had gone on between those men. At the same time, it was as wise as a living beast lying hopelessly beside a dead mate. The blackbird held long conversations that day. He spoke to Kim, and at least in the blackbird's mind, Kim answered. Sometimes the two of them argued, although we only heard Blackbird's side of the matter. If anyone approached them, the blackbird raised his weapon. After the first few minutes, everyone left him alone. The blackbird nearly died because he was left alone. As evening came and the helicopters began switching on landing lights in order to find the beaten surface of the fields, it was time for us to leave. The remaining Marines were being evacuated. I arranged to take my sailors back to the ship. North and I went to persuade the blackbird. It was time to leave. He was nearly dead when we got to him. He sat astraddle Kim's body. The blackbird had cut his wrists with a great deal of care. The cuts were just deep enough to give a steady but not gushing flow of blood. The blackbird was dripping the blood into the chest wound of the corpse, as though trying to resurrect Kim. He must have been at it for quite a while. The blackbird was so weak from loss of blood that he could not struggle. He stared at us dumbly as we stopped the blood and yelled for a medic. Blackbird was airlifted out. He was sent to a hospital, then to a detention center while his wrists healed. He was discharged for mental disabilities said to exist prior to his enlistment. No pension. No disability payments. The military, which views routine destruction as a rational process, stands aghast when the subject is suicide. For some years I received strange postcards from the blackbird. Sometimes the only message was the drawing of a black face, a black feather. Sometimes he drew flowers or cactus. The postcards came from Reno, Salt Lake, Pocatello. Well, the postcards came from all over the West. Once he wrote that he was teaching horses how to fight cowboys. His messages were scrawled in crayon. And this is the history, except for a little tidying up. I represented North at his court-martial. He received a month's restriction to the ship, a 1/2 forfeiture of pay for that month. I was transferred to a small boat basin. A reprimand went with me. My fitness report stated that I was totally inept at logistics. The reports did admit that I knew how to fire rockets. Tidying up. In the years that followed, I saw North once on a visit he made to San Francisco. I kept in touch with the blackbird by mail. Some vague thought of friendship or of penance, something, kept me writing to him. I figured that sooner or later he'd need a lawyer. It was raining lightly when I passed Portland and out of Oregon, then entered the far northwest. The state of Washington seemed intent on showing its most somber tones. The highways were beaten and slick. Dark fir forests were cut here and there with a fainter darkness of alder and madrona. The coast road ran past beaches. It took a long loop into dripping forests as it bypassed an Indian reservation. It's a rare day even in summer when that coast does not get rain. Seals and seabirds appeared like spirits from the coastal mist. Huge rocks stood like ancient tombstones, water-worn testimonials to the 20,000 years of human life and death that have muttered through this rain. An eternity of rain stained the roofs of cabins, and moss covered the cedar shingles of cabins like thick watch caps. The cabins were shrouded. The land was shrouded. In the small town, the Chinese owner of a sagging and weather-worn restaurant gave me directions to North's house. The Oriental face here in a place wetter than the Everglades was a small shock, but not a surprise. Chinese have been on this coast for more than a century, as have Japanese and Taiwanese. The Orientals arrived as bond slaves. They were excellent workers. Enslaved Indians were not. In the late afternoon, and beneath dark and raining skies, North's house was a small beacon in the darkness of the surrounding forest. Every light in the place was glowing. The potholed lane to the house was overhung with branches. Water filled the ditches, and in one place crossed the lane. I parked beside an old pickup that was connected to a new horse trailer. Painted on the door of the truck was a cartoon head of a surprised bird. The truck's body was a patched-together shack. It looked like a tent made up of shingles, but knowing the blackbird, I was certain it didn't leak. I stepped from the car. There was movement at the edge of the forest. A deep memory of movement in the jungle automatically pushed me down. I knelt beside the car, onto my knees in wet soil. The pistol was packed in my luggage. Defenseless. Then, remembering where I was, silently cursing the forest and myself, I stood back up. There were sounds coming from the edge of the forest. A small, dark figure stood beside a bulk that moved, stopped, moved. The darkness of the forest was intense, but not intense enough to cover the solid blackness of those two figures. Then a miniature spot of white, like fluorescence, darted between the two figures. It moved like a hand. "This is not a fit place," the blackbird said. "We'll be out of here in a couple of days." He stepped from the background of the forest, leading a large black horse with white stockings. The horse was a giant, but it moved light-footed and gracefully. It looked stern, wary. "Stay away from this horse," the blackbird said conversationally. "He's a meat-eater." I watched as the blackbird loaded the horse back into the trailer, then rubbed it down. It looked likely that the horse would be more comfortable than any of us. There was enough room in that dry trailer for 2 horses. The blackbird's right hand was white, like a hand dipped in flour. He was wet. Water soaked his western hat and his jeans jacket. Water had glistened on the dark side of the horse. In the growing darkness, the only thing finally visible was that skeletal hand. "You brought a horse," I said, speaking into the darkness. "All the way from Montana?" "I got nothing against Montana," the blackbird said easily. "It's just that nobody else can handle this one." He gestured back to the horse. "I'm saving Montana some trouble." He closed the rear of the trailer. "I'll be along directly," he said to the horse. He turned. "You never know how much they understand," he said. "I always tell them how long it'll be." He took off his hat. His hair was a thick braid. Feathers were interwoven in the braid. Black feathers. Crow. Raven. The 2 watches looked oversized on the narrow wrists. He knocked water from the hat. The white hand was not all white. The tattooing traced along the skeletal structure. Some unknown tattoo artist was a genius. The bones seemed to lie above the surface of the hand, the flesh under the bones. The watch built for combat was a thick, low-glowing lump above the whiteness. His left hand was not as dark as the rest of him. Later on, I would see it was tattooed the color of Kim's face. "I'd rather be seeing you in San Francisco," the blackbird said. "But since it's here, I'm glad anyway." The blackbird does not lie, and so he was glad. "Sure," I said, "San Francisco. But since we're here, come on to the truck. We won't be going in there for a while." He motioned toward North's house, then walked toward the truck. It was no bad thing to sit in the cab of that truck. Smells of oil and harness and horse dung soaked the worn seat covers. One windshield was cracked. The gearshift knob was a carved blackbird. "Why not?" I asked, pointed towards North's house. I looked through the rain-running windshield at the rain-covered forest. The truck cab was dry. "The doctor figures North's gonna die," Blackbird said, and he said it like a joke. "The preacher figures North's going to hell. North's sort of resisting." "Drinking?" "I doubt if I'd want to do it sober myself," Blackbird chuckled. "Or maybe I would. If a man gets too crocked, he'd lose all interest. You can see how that'd go." "Drinking now?" The Blackbird laughed. "He's sitting in there with a fifth in that blame old 45. He's all set to shoot something. Best if it isn't us." "Himself? Shoot himself?" "Nope," the Blackbird said. "North never did amount to much, and he sure don't amount to that much." The white hand rested on the gear shift. "I've heard of folks having ghosts," he said, "but I never knew a man to have a whole Kyoto of them." "I told him to stay sober," I said. Then I felt like a man confessed to prudishness. "He was sober when I got here. The minute I got here, he felt real safe." The Blackbird laughed, almost giddily. "Safe," he said, chuckling. "I don't know a thing about horses," I said. "I don't know a damn thing about anything else," the Blackbird said. "I think I know things. I think I know just heaps. But all I can guarantee is horses." And then suddenly we were both laughing. We were hysterical with the laughter. Laughed in each other's faces. We ho-hoed and he-he'd like schoolgirls at a slumber party. We giggled, chortled, yelped with laughter. I mentioned that there was a man in that house, a man who had saved both our lives at one time or other, a dying man, and that made us laugh even harder. The blackbird slapped his knees, slapped mine. We went yuck, yuck, and woo, woo. We banged our fists on the dashboard. Tears came from the laughter. I hugged the blackbird as if the bird were a solid post to which I could cling and not fall in a faint from the laughter. "Maybe it's the rain," the blackbird said with a chuckle. "Maybe you got to either laugh or hit somebody." He wiped tears. "Fool," he said. "Our boy figures that Buddhist monkey shot's coming for him. Figures the Buddhist is bringing all his relations." I sat giggling into the darkness and rain. Maybe death was coming to North, but not in the form of a Buddhist monk. A monk would be indifferent to all that. "Those people have a lot of relatives," I said, and I tried to say it soberly, but I still had to swallow a chuckle. "North needn't worry about the Buddhist, just his next of kin." Blackbird rolled down the window. He stared toward North's house. "He'll pass out directly." "Something that isn't funny," I said. "This is the first time we've been together when there was no combat." It was a little surprising to think of that. The blackbird straightened, poked a finger at the rain. "You've been living too soft," he muttered, suddenly serious. "Don't let down." North was a big man. It took a lot of whiskey to put him away. When night came on and the forest turned black, the blackbird drove me, truck and horse, into town. We parked between logging trucks and ate dinner in a weather-worn hotel. We spoke together like brothers. People around us glanced at the blackbird's hand and continued chewing. Salmon, steak, potatoes. Loggers burped and yawned and scratched their armpits. An Indian waitress and a Chinese waiter made silent crossing patterns around the tables. Along the bar, some awfully young drunks and a few awfully old ones muttered to each other or gambled on punchboards. The people were indifferent to the blackbird's hand and to the feathers in his braided hair. I thought better of the people, if not the place. This is still the frontier, I told myself, or something very much like it. The blackbird had a story. He'd drifted through both the plains and the mountainous west. He made his living from trading out of his truck. "I got a masterpiece inventory. I got tack and shotgun shells and gym cracks. Got car parts and rope, mostly legal stuff." And he made his living by befriending horses that no one else could handle. "I got away with them." And working an occasional rodeo. "With never no more than a busted collarbone. Not bad for a boy from Philadelphia." He won races at country fairs, riding that giant horse. Because he won races, he won bets. "I've been nosing around," the blackbird said. "After North commenced nursing that bottle, I exercised the horse. There's a trail back in North's house. Leads up into the jungle." He grinned at his mistake. "Leads up into the forest." The blackbird chewed steak and looked like a man sitting on a thunderous joke. "The fool," he said about North. "His guilt's brought that boy back to the one place he should never be. There's 2 graveyards up there, Indian and Chinese. I don't care for either one of them. That Indian one is special." The Indian graveyard was filled with elaborately carved cedar rails, fashioned to imitate enormous beds. The rails surrounded the Indian graves. The dead were buried in symbolic beds. "In pretty good shape," the blackbird said, "considering the rain. Looks like a sort of weird furniture store. Got slugs and moss and spiders. Beds are all decorated with them. Got these great big snails and white worms." He chewed, slurped at coffee, and the feathers in his braided hair gleamed in the fluorescent light of the restaurant. "It all seems pretty honest when you see it that way," he said. "All them slugs and things. I got this kind of calm feeling, like death's okay." "Don't like that feeling. We all know that ain't right." "It might not be a bad feeling," I told him. "Sooner or later it all comes to that. Might feel all right if you could think of dying as a calm feeling." The blackbird looked at me in a way that said he worried about me. "You've been living way too easy," he said. "And you haven't seen that other graveyard." The blackbird mopped gravy with a piece of bread. He looked around the room, looked at the Chinese waiter, then looked through the windows into the night. He checked the time on the combat watch. "Let's go see if there's anything left of our boy." North was passed out and snoring in a chair when we entered the house. A wood fire lay dying in the fireplace. When we switched off some of the lights, the fire became the focus of the room, a comment of darkened coal and ash. Outside, the dripping forest was painted with darkness, a wall of darkness. I had not seen North in a long time. Beneath the remaining lights, his face was red, his hair white, and breath gargled from his throat in sobbing snores. He was dressed in work clothes, booted, wearing a fisherman's coat. In his hand, which lay in his lap, the .45 automatic was dark and oiled. Except for the sleep and the stink of booze, North was a man dressed and armed for action. A man ready to rush into the night. What was he intending to do? Shoot a ghost? Blackbird fed up the fire. There's a couple rooms upstairs. Take one. I'm gonna sleep with a horse. He began searching the house, looking in closets. I stood watching North. The Blackbird was gone for several minutes, rummaging through the kitchen and the upstairs rooms. He returned carrying an old .30-30 carbine and 3 kitchen knives. I'll keep these beside me, he said. That way, if North berserks, the worst he can do is smack you with a broom. He's that far gone? I was ready to go back to the motel and take a room. Blackbird picked up the nearly empty fifth. I figure you got time for a night's sleep, he said. I'll make him to wake up come noon tomorrow. He walked to North. Or maybe never. The Blackbird reached toward North, took the .45 from his hand. He stood above North, a small black figure, befeathered but contemplative. He seemed to be musing over the effects of history and combat and booze. Blackbird ejected the magazine from the .45, but he did not work the slide. Maybe there was a bullet in the pistol's chamber, maybe not. It all depended on how good North was at soldiering. You did not arm your weapon before you need it. Blackbird cocked the piece. He placed the barrel beneath North's chin, pointed at the throat, smiled, giggled, laughed, lowered the gun and turned to me. See this here? He indicated North. We came all this way to help this man. What are you doing? Cut the clowning. I'm a gambler, the Blackbird said. He watched North's flushed face, listened to the breath snorting from North's mouth. I owe this man a debt, and he owes me. Let's leave North's ghost to settle us up. The Blackbird did not look insane. He was standing easily, mildly humorous, resigned to some imagined fate that I would not divine. It sorts out like this, the Blackbird said. If there's a shell in this chamber, then North's gone. He's got no more problems. I'll have taken care of him and paid my debt. He looked at me. You understand that? North doesn't want to die, I said. Who does? He doesn't want to live in hell either. But death or hell are all the choices this boy's got. Flames were beginning to lick the new wood in the fireplace. The flames were tentative, searching for the easiest area of combustion. In my mind lay an old darkness cut with flames. What do you mean? I said desperately. What do you mean, let the ghosts decide? I was stalling for time. The Blackbird's face gradually woke into a slow smile. Maybe a smile cannot be called historic, but this was a smile filled with memories. I'm going to talk here for a minute about Kim, the Blackbird said. Kim was a man. North snored. The new fire crackled. Night seemed to press against the windows. You know why Kim contacted the enemy? Blackbird asked. You ever think about why Kim called down fire? I've thought about it. They weren't good thoughts, so I stopped thinking. The Blackbird gestured to the dark windows, to the black night. That's our hearts, he said in a general way. Our hearts were flat as those windows. We were little more than kids. We were in combat. We were the enemy, the Blackbird said. We enemized everything. The dead, the children, all them others. He looked down at North. And with never a lick of respect. The light was growing as the fire stood brilliantly in the new logs. Shadows flickered on the wall like spirits. In my mind, Deep from the darkness of my mind, figures began to walk. Then the figures began to fall, clutching guts or grabbing at faces that were all alight with flames. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't do this." And I meant, don't make me recall. Just shoot north and get this over, but don't make me recall. "We were looking at the face of something powerful," the blackbird said. "Something mighty old. We didn't even know it." "Shoot him," I whispered. "Don't talk." I stood shocked, desperate, a willing conspirator in murder, a man betraying a friend. Echoes of rockets seemed to fill the room. "These ghosts," the blackbird said easily, "are hungry. They're the spirits of hunger. Kim knew. They'll never feel no peace, ever. This here," and he laid the pistol beside North's head, "this here is a blessing for this man. Worst it does, maybe, is send him to his preacher's hell." The words caused me to gain some self-control. After all, the blackbird was insane. I was being persuaded by insanity. "We've already been there," I said. "Only one hell to a customer." "Those ghosts are always lonesome, always hungry for food, booze, sex. They're hungry for some kind of god somewhere, hungry for sleep and pretty things, and hungry for stars and being warm." The blackbird's voice was an incantation. "Hungry for sunlight, kinfolk, and laughing with friends. They're starving for all those things and blowing across the world forever, howling and hungry." He turned to me. "They scream a lot. They just wail and wail. Kim said so." He looked at North. "And they're hungry for this man. They will make him one of them, and they will be hungry." "Shoot," I said. The fire crackled. When rockets fall into the jungle, flames spread. Mostly, though, it goes straight up, a steeple of fire, pointed diabolic praise to heaven. "Shoot," I whispered. The blackbird looked at me curiously. The black weapon glowed dull in the spectral white hand. Blackbird looked around the room, held the pistol to North's temple, paused. "It'll make a mess," he said. "This would make a nice little house for somebody. Best if we just mess up a chair." He moved the pistol to North's chest, felt for the exact spot, and the hammer went click against an empty chamber. The blackbird stood looking at North. "Pretty good soldiering," he said. He threw the .45 on North's lap. "I got the magazine," he said to me. "Things will be safe around here." He walked to the door, turned back, looked at North. The blackbird checked the time on one watch, then checked the time on the other. He looked more serious than he had when he pulled the trigger. "You gotta understand about time," he said, and he sounded like a teacher leveling with a favorite student. "There's all the time there is, all the time." I was confused. "There's the time when North is a ghost, and there's a time when he isn't. Only mystery about the whole thing was whether he was actually going to be a ghost." The blackbird showed me the watches. "There's the time when you weren't a lawyer, and the time when you are. There's the time when you weren't born and the time when you're dead. All them times are scampering. Right now, like the mouse on this watch." He opened the door, turned back, looked at North. "You shouldn't have laughed," he said to North's sleeping figure. "Everybody did bad things, but you were the man who laughed." Blackbird stepped into the night. I crossed the room, watching through the window. In the darkness, nothing could be seen but that spectral hand, and it was soon swallowed in darkness. I turned back to North, the man who still snorted because he was good at soldiering. I hadn't expected him to be that good. "Whatever happens," I said, "remember that the blackbird tried to help." The thought came that sometimes it's no bad thing to be insane. The rain stopped sometime during the night. I slept the sleep of combat. It does not allow the luxury of dreams. A part of the mind pays attention for each whisper, each footfall. I was surprised to awake refreshed, but with an accompanying depression. I'd been a willing co-conspirator to murder. The murder had not happened, but that made no difference. In a dawn of blown clouds, my complicity seemed a gauge of madness. I'd once again discovered that when you live beside madness, you become mad. Thick clouds blew before a refreshing wind, and the forest turned from black to the sullen darkness of a stormy day. I made coffee, sat in the kitchen, slurped the coffee, and watched through the window. North had rolled from the chair. Now he snored as he lay at full length on the carpet. No one, except Blackbird and maybe North, could understand the gift the Blackbird had offered. In a sane world, it was an insane gift. All the nicey nice people would lift hands in horror, would cover their eyes. The sanitary people would insist that North go to a hospital, be needled and probed and sliced and oxygenated, preserved through a sort of medical embalming against whatever was killing him. The nicey nice people, so busy at not dying that they're too busy to live, would insist that North's ghosts were an aberration of psychology. Kim knew the ghosts were real. North seemed to know it. That was enough to justify and give praise to the Blackbird's action. Because insanity causes its own reality. If the ghosts were real to North, and they were clearly more real than most people's sense of their gods, then the ghosts were real. The Blackbird appeared on horseback. The figures emerged in the lane. They were figures of black on black. It was hard to understand how a man from the slums of Philadelphia could gain complete wisdom of horses. Yet Blackbird looked knitted, not sculptured. He was of a single piece with that horse, a painting, art, or this. He looked somehow like the dreams of men. The primitive energy and the unconscious power of that man on that horse made him look the way all of us had wished we could look when we were young. When he broke into a brief run, the horse stretched like a wave. It was agile and godlike. I wondered how the Blackbird could even get someone to bet against him when he raced such a horse. He rode to the house. He tied the horse to a post that held up a sagging porch. I expected him to enter the house. Instead, he leaned against the post and spoke to the horse. He seemed to be having a conversation. A flicker of memory spread painful fingers in my mind. A memory of the Blackbird lying beside Kim's corpse, conversing. After an hour, several things happened at once. I called my office. A strange voice answered. Miss Molly was not at work, the voice said. The voice claimed to belong to some temporary helper service. I felt slight indignation. Miss Molly, the voice said, was tending her father, who was ill. Are you a person? I asked. I'm not talking to a computer. The voice gave a name. Cynthia Seymour, or Lydia Claymore, something. Then in sanitary tones, the voice said, Mrs. Claymore or Seymour. Not Mrs. Computer? It was not a sarcastic question. The voice sniffed. This is the boss, I recall muttering. Take messages until Molly returns. Do nothing else. Don't even open the mail. The voice advised me the temporary helper people were skillfully trained. Behind me, North began to thrash around. Then he began to moan. The Blackbird had finished speaking to the horse. He drifted into the kitchen and headed for the coffee pot. Open the mail if you must, I told the voice. Flush the toilet when necessary, but don't do anything. Make no decisions. I hung up with an uneasy feeling. Reality and unreality kept shifting in my mind. North handled his hangover with a good deal of skill. He bumbled into the kitchen, poured coffee and fruit juice and water and beer. He sipped the coffee, gulped from the glasses, and his pale Scandinavian face was a portrait that would frighten a coroner. The face seemed washed by rain. Death was painted in the eyes. The cheeks sagged with death, and death smoothed his already smooth forehead. His hands trembled. The coffee cup clicked against his teeth. When he smiled, and incredibly he did smile, the smile was like a flicker of vanishing life swallowed in the death mask of that face. "Couple more beers," he said, "and this mess will get straight." He looked at me like a man judging a car he might buy, like a man about to kick tires, a man thinking of a deal. "Thanks for making the trip." His voice was half humorous, deprecating, and hungover. "You drove right into hell's half-acre." "You're going to throw up," the Blackbird said. "Can't mix that much juice with that much beer." "That's why I'm doing it. Cleans the system. North seemed to be trying to ignore the blackbird. He seemed nearly apologetic. It's your throw-up, the blackbird said. Just point it where it don't get controversial. The blackbird reached in his shirt pocket. He threw the loaded .45 magazine on the table. Next time, mind your manners, he said. It got that bad? North slugged juice, slugged beer. We 3 ex-warriors sat around the kitchen table that was covered with green oilcloth. The .45 magazine lay on the table. The blackbird flicked it hard with his index finger. The magazine spun, pointed towards North. Spin the bottle, the blackbird said. You're one down. Blackbird spun the magazine again. You're one down, he told me. He looked at North. We can't be having any lies around here. I tried to shoot you last night. The blackbird's face is proportional to the rest of him, which means it's small. The forehead bulges slightly, but the lips are thin. The voice coming from those lips was conversational. North looked at me, then at Blackbird. His water-smoothed face was dull and unsurprised. Light from the kitchen window glowed softly on the bullet that pressed against the top lip of the magazine. He must not have tried very hard, North said. Not sure what I think about you fouling up. He placed pale hands on the table, pushed himself into a standing position. This juice is doing its good work. I'll be right back. He headed for the bathroom. North was never a stupid man. Although cunning, he had no great reputation for lying. He was dying. His face was a shroud behind which countless and awful emotions must have already fought. It seemed to me he was handling matters pretty well. Outside, the horse stomped, seemed to be sighing to itself. They know, the blackbird said about the horse. That one's wanted no part of this since we got here. The room actually became darker when North returned. Clouds blew in layers. Up there in a gusty firmament, the clouds were painting the forest with darkness. It'll breeze like this. Come mid-afternoon, it'll commence to blow. Then we'll get a couple days of broken clouds. North took his seat at the table, sipped beer. The blackbird hates this place, he said to me, and he spoke as if Blackbird were not sitting beside him. It's home, he said. I fished these waters since I was a kid. Man ought to be allowed to die at home. The horse made snuffling noises. Then it gave a low whinny. Blackbird stood. You'd be better off doing it in St. Louis, he said. He walked to the door. His dander's up, he said about the horse. I gotta let that poor fella out. He'll drag the house down. Stepped outside. What's the problem? I asked North. You said over the phone that you needed a safe place to die. Spirit fences, North said. It's a long story. It was not a particularly long story. In the last century, Chinese moved in and caused a graveyard. They didn't mean to do it, but they had no idea that they were enlisting as bond slaves to work at processing lime. The work was cruel. Their death rate was appalling. They were buried in that graveyard and with little hope that their bones would ever be returned to China. Folks around here, North said, never paid it any mind. That graveyard sat there for 70 years. The fences would decay. Somebody'd fix them. Folks pretty much mind their own business. Chinese stay to themselves and do Chinese things. Blackbird says I shouldn't have come, but Chinese never had any power around here before. Outside in the narrow clearing, the blackbird was exercising the horse. Blackbird had the horse on a long tether. The horse was galloping or trotting, or whatever horses do, in a wide circle. The black animal seemed to blend in, then flash from the black spaces of the forest. The white stockings moved brilliantly, as accurate as the blackbird's hands. North still looked pale, but now he was no longer in resigned control. His hands were shaking again. I never did anything to those people, he said. I never tore up those graves. 2 decades before, when North and Blackbird and I were in the jungle, satanic cults in San Francisco began paying $100 apiece for human skulls. Nobody around here did it, North said. Maybe some people from Oregon, maybe some San Francisco people. So the fences are down again. Feelings of fire, of rocketry lay in my mind. Beyond the windows, the black horse trotted like a circus horse. Insanity seemed the one normal way of looking at things. I envied the blackbird. It isn't just the fences, North said. The grave robbers didn't even backfill. Bones exposed. It's all covered with fir needles now, but the graves are holes. Water standing in some. North looked absolutely indignant. I had nothing to do with it. I wasn't even around here at the time. He looked at me, and then there was supplication in the look. There was also cunning. I killed a monk, he said. That guy's coming for me. I hear him up there, whispering, squalling. They wail. They do it around the house at midnight. North was trying to speak matter-of-factly, but his voice trembled, so did his hands. That monk did not have to die, I said. He was proving a point. You saw monks over there. Sometimes they sat in the paths of tanks. You saw the tanks move into a higher gear. That monk was protesting. Beyond the windows, the black horse circled as though it were the second hand on an enormous watch. I was the guy who let him do it. North popped open another can of beer and looked at it. You don't get the DTs until you stop drinking, he explained. It ain't DTs. It's real voices. At least I think so. That's why I asked you guys here. Blackbird's insane, but you're sane. I need some other ways of seeing this, because my judgment's gone. The man looked pitiful. He was, for every intent and purpose, dead. The dark skies beyond the window were a frame for a face that was already ghostly. I wished I could get him so drunk the alcohol would kill him. The thought came and left. The spirits start wailing at sunset, North said. At least I can hear them. If you and if Blackbird both hear them, then God help me. He tried to shrug, then drank instead. My only other chance is to take my boat into deep water and drown. He tapped a pale finger on the oilcloth. Be a shame, he said. There's a couple of young fellows around here could use that boat. The look of cunning did not leave his face. North made me feel he was running a confidence game. Don't be so sure that I'm sane. It was the only honest reply. I was all right before I got here. Then I thought of something. Why didn't the grave robbers tear up the Indian graveyard? When you see it, you'll feel why, North said. The Indian graveyard explained itself better than North, or even Blackbird, could explain. We passed it as we ascended to the Chinese graveyard. But that happened later on, towards sunset. North drank more beer, forced down some food, and slept. Blackbird did minor work on his truck. When he opened the door of the shack-like truck body, the first thing visible was a row of rifles. Make a lot of money swapping guns and stuff, Blackbird said. When I approached the horse, it struck forward with a front hoof. The strike was sharp, deft. The hoof smacked the ground like a hammer. He won't make friends, the Blackbird told me. Don't get stupid and walk behind him. I had never looked carefully at a horse before. This animal showed me nothing about horses, only something about itself. It was as precise as a hawk. It carried the energy and power that can focus so quickly in huge animals. I imagined this horse fighting a grizzly and could see no end to such a fight. At least no ending that would not leave both beasts dead. This horse was as frightening as elemental force. Strong winds or storms, gale force, volcanic. You don't much get along with other horses either. The Blackbird was cleaning spark plugs. Grease from the engine stained his hands. The white hand floated above the engine, deft in the shadowed compartment. He's not even much of a ladies' man. Then movement began in the forest. At least it seemed that movement was going on in there. I no longer trusted my sanity. I expect it's Indian ghost stuff, the Blackbird said. Goes on all the time in Montana. Don't give it a never mind. Blackbird worked with his back to the forest. He was actually humming as he tightened spark plugs. Movement in the jungle is almost always felt, not seen. When you watch for it, you may be sure you will not see it. Movement in the jungle is picked up sometimes at the edge of vision. More often it's picked up by a feeling in the belly or a chill that starts in the spine. Twice during the afternoon I nearly hit the deck, expecting the rake of gunfire. The Blackbird finished with the spark plugs. He crawled beneath the truck. I told you not to let down, he said. Man, you're starting to fly. Don't get too high. His voice echoed, and the wind that North had predicted was beginning as a light breeze. It pays to pay attention, Blackbird said, but not to that forest. Memories and compulsions were congregating. For years I'd discarded thoughts, reasoned out my position on bad memories. Now I pulled my pistol from the luggage, a little pea-shooter .38 of the kind favored by judges and attorneys. There are a lot of these snub-noses all through the law business. We pretend they don't exist. But then we try divorces and assaults and sanity hearings, and we pretend that human emotions are objective, that for the purpose of law, emotions don't exist. We thus own .38s. A part of my mind knew it was gripped by old madness, but the madness had its own genius. It kept picking up movement in the forest. If it is Chinese, the Blackbird said, I doubt they're after you. You get too wired, you'll get all wore out. His voice echoed from beneath the truck. He was talking to himself. Ought to get another 10,000 miles from this clutch. Old truck, don't owe me nothing. In mid-afternoon, the wind picked up and blew steadily. The forest came alive. Fir tops and cedar tops moved 100 feet above our heads. Spatters of rain colored them. The Blackbird finished fooling with the truck. North stepped from his house. He was booted, dressed in work clothes, and wore an old down jacket. This is August, the Blackbird said. Don't it ever get warm around here? Happens sometimes, North said, but not so often you come to expect it. He looked at me, the way I was dressed. Pretty dandy outfit, he said. There's old coats and stuff hanging in the pantry. Then he looked at the forest. The treetops still moved. Lower in the darkness, the movement now seemed random, like nearly invisible targets popping up and down at a shooting gallery. Go away, he said to the forest. His voice was trembling. You see that? He said to the Blackbird. Tell me you don't see that. Blackbird leaned against his truck. On the door of the truck, the picture of the surprised bird seemed suddenly amusing. I could imagine a time when Blackbird had painted the picture. Could imagine him chuckling as he laughed at himself. I'm with a bunch of crazies, Blackbird said. You guys are spooked. The horse is spooked. You crazies have gone and got the forest spooked. Of course I see it. Why not? I won't swear that I see it, I told North. But if I do see it, then it's been going on for quite a while. How can a man be dying when he don't even feel hurt, North said. I walk as good as ever, got no pain in the gut. He seemed to be trying to convince himself that the whole business was a charade. He pulled the .45 from a jacket pocket and worked the slide. He placed the pistol to his face and looked down the barrel. Hello, old friend, he said to the pistol. You want to take another ride? Hard to shoot yourself in the nose with a .45, the Blackbird said conversationally. You about have to tape down that rear safety. I got flexible hands, North said. He spun, crouched, and let off a shot into the forest. The boom of the heavy pistol engulfed the clearing, was swallowed in the forest. North let off another shot. The forest stood dark, unmoved, but moving. The horse stomped, whinnied. It tugged hard at the reins tied to the porch. The porch roof shook. You do that again, the Blackbird said, and you don't need to worry about no Chinese. He moved across the clearing, bird-like, a flicker of dark light. He stood by the horse's head, talking to the horse. You might be better off drowning, I said to North. All three of us have lost our senses. North looked at the forest. It'll be sunset in an hour. Might as well get it over with. He shucked the magazine, then shucked the shell into the chamber. He was stalling, intentionally wasting time. I clucked and cautioned, while Blackbird complained. North went to the house, insisted that we eat. He protested that we must hurry, and then he held back. When we finally entered the forest, North led. I followed. The Blackbird walked at the rear. He led the horse. North complained bitterly about the horse. The Blackbird told him the horse was spooked, but it was North's fault, and that if North couldn't handle it, the Blackbird would fix matters so that North could handle it. We carried waterproof flashlights, and the blackbird carried a small duffel. The horse carried a pack. By the time we returned, the forest would be wrapped in night. The gradually rising trail was wide. With care, 2 men might walk it side by side. "It narrows after the Indian graveyard," North said. No description could really prepare me for that place. It was scattered across the face of the hill. Trees were thinned. Large grandfather trees rose into the wind and blowing mist. The color was red, russet, from cedar that towered into the decaying daylight. Red like the fur of a wet fox, or the soft auburn of decaying maple leaves. The graveyard was a grove in which tangles of vine maple crisscrossed in flowing patterns. Wind moved through the leaves, although this deep in the forest the wind was shattered and inconsistent. High in the tops of trees the wind was steady, and it was blowing a gale. Headstones leaned or had fallen flat. The bed-like structures, some of them ornate, glistened with the rusty color of red cedar. It was not like a furniture store at all. The enormous beds were at many angles and distances. They were not in rows, although where families were buried, some were in clusters. Cedar and fir boughs lay as fresh decorations across the enormous beds. It seemed that the storm was ornamenting the graveyard as it tugged branches from trees and dropped them into the forest. "You feel it?" The blackbird was talking to me, or to the horse. "A dead man could feel it," I whispered. Power lay calmly across the graveyard. The power was so evident, so serene, that even if my mind were not in a frenzy, it would still feel the power. In fact, as the power became omnipotent, my frenzy faded. Tranquility, calm, peace. Nothing foul could enter here. North was becoming nervous. I could not understand why. "It's a trick," he said, and he seemed to be speaking to the forest. "A man dies here and you send ravens, don't you? Don't you?" He stopped, looked back at me and Blackbird. "Don't be fooled," he said. "I know Indians, know their ways. They control ravens and crows. They get fancy on revenge." His face was pale in the gathering dark. A white moon of a face rising against the red background of the graveyard. "You feel it waiting there? Feel it waiting? They control owls and rats and anything that bites." "What'd you ever do to Indians?" The blackbird was actually grinning. The white hand rested on the horse's neck as we stopped. The white hand gestured, seemed to float toward the graveyard. "Indians don't care about you. Listen how quiet it is. Just hear how much they don't care about you." "People experimented," North said. "Back in the old days, these Indians have got cousins laid out here and up above. There's Chinese Indians, but no Indian Chinese because..." And he breathed in sobbing snorts, fear-ridden and finally yelling, "Because there wasn't no Chinese women!" To North, the matter was strangely important. It was easy to see just how far his fears and his fantasies had carried him. "I know lots about Indians," the blackbird tried to answer seriously, tried not to giggle. "These people just tending their own fences. You just one more crazy white man don't mean nothing to them." Blackbird dropped his hand, urged the horse forward. "Get along," he said to me and North, "or I'll let go these reins." The graveyard was a quiet presence at our backs as we climbed. I followed North, knowing now that he was insane with his fear. A gulf of fear, a chasm. I followed him and waited for him to stumble, to fall, to plead to some Scandinavian god, to pray for storms or the sanctuary of crosses, of angels' wings. A prayer in stained glass, a prayer for burial inside a church. The trail narrowed. Low sweeping fir and maple branches brushed the horse's flanks. The strip of sky above the trail was red and distant. A narrow band above a land of wind and growing darkness. North stumbled forward. Movement began in the forest. I paused, looked back down the trail. The Indian graveyard was obscured by trees and encroaching darkness. "You see that?" North whispered. "You see it?" "I see it," I said, and I was whispering as well. The movement was as deft as the flicker of bat wings. It was a movement of pale shadows. It appeared and disappeared right on the edge of vision. If the blackbird's white hand was magic, if it could suddenly appear and disappear in all the places where eyes were not looking, then that would describe the shadows. "Whoa up," the blackbird said. The horse was not shying, but it was focused. It looked the way a horse must look just before a race. The animal was huge, a great dark bulk filling the narrow trail. Its breath was heavy, the sound like a promise of power layering the darkness and the red gloom of the trail. If the horse decided to break, the blackbird would be flung like a wadded piece of carbon paper. North and I probably could not dive from the trail quickly enough. We would be trampled. "No talk," the blackbird said. "I have to get this poor fellow to that clearing. Quick, quiet. You people know what to do. You've been in the jungle." The word hung like a sudden fury in my mind. Jungle. My pattern of movement changed, which is to say I accepted the sanity of an old madness. In combat, there is no sanity, only useful ways of being insane. Insanity is the only way to survive, and insanity forces its own patterns of movement. We went rapidly up that trail, and our feet were silent. Our feet knew where to place themselves. Our feet did not kick branches, pebbles. They did not skid on wet soil. Jungle. Combat. We entered the Chinese graveyard more silently than whispers. Light drained from the forest like a riptide between rocks. The sun must already have been on the horizon. There was no peace there, only violation. In this graveyard, there was a state of war. Pale remnants of spirit fences rose crazily on broken angles above the forest debris. Graves stood nearly erect on the steep hillside as if the dead had been buried on deliberately uncomfortable angles. The excavated graves were like empty faces, stripped bones. The hill was so steep one could imagine the dead men had stood in congregations. It was a huge graveyard, a lot larger than the Indian graveyard. The Chinese had been in these parts for 100 years, more or less, and the Indians for 20,000. And yet this was a graveyard that seemed as large as the antiquity of all suffering. "That's why the skulls survived, why they were worth digging," I murmured. "The hillside graves drain. That's a mostly dry hillside in the middle of a rainforest." Some of the more favored graves were situated along breaks in the hill. When they were interred, the corpses had lain flat. Now stagnant water stood in these torn graves. In the decay of light and putridity of stagnant water and debris, total darkness would seem a blessing. "No matter your fear," I whispered to North. "Nothing makes it right for you to have brought us here. Man, of all places on earth, this is the place where you should not be." Spirit fences are not huge. Many are no taller than the ornamental fences gardeners place around their flowers. The power of the fence is the power of symbol, and here the symbols were a chaos of killed voices. The symbols denoted the death of delicacy, of faith, of love, trust, respect, honor, memory. Some of the fences had been intricately carved. I directed my flashlight here, there. A fragment lay almost at my feet. Was I standing on a grave? And the fragment, 4 or 5 inches of paint-flaked and faded scrap wood, carried such finite and patient carving that it represented years of skill and hours of work. Enough natural light remained that the flashlight beam was diffused. But I clung to the flashlight. In this place it was more precious than fire, weapons, food. In this place, it meant survival. A way to get out. "Pretty quick now," North whispered. His voice trembled. "I pray to God I hear those voices just because of the DTs, or just from being crazy. Maybe you guys won't hear them." His voice sounded as if he were trying to be sincere, but was making a bad job of it. Blackbird stood silent. He was memorizing the terrain. There were no trees in the graveyard except for a few old snags. The wind blew over the lip of the surrounding forest. It poured against the hillside, churned among the violated graves. The chaos of a battlefield comes not from corpses, but from disarray. Trees are broken, Bodies are broken as well, but it's the shattered vegetation and the shattered works of men that make the chaos. I once saw an explosion in a train carrying passengers and produce. I saw broken leaves of vegetables, the red pulp of tomatoes washing a ruptured steel, and newspapers rising from a club car carried like spirits on the wind. The papers rose and circled in a flume of fire. "Folks say I'm crazy," the blackbird murmured to the horse. Horse stood silent, nearly calm after the ascent. I had the sudden belief that the horse was listening to the blackbird's explanation, and that the horse understood. "Maybe I am," the blackbird said, "but I ain't crazy now. We got to a place like this, and the bird knows the territory." North's hand caressed the useless .45. "It's startin'." Only a memory of light remained. The forest was as black as the blackbird's skin, and, like the blackbird, alive. The wind was a voice, and it pressed high above our heads as if it swept all light towards caverns at the end of the world. The movement was no longer on the edge of vision. It was no longer entirely in the forest. We watched the movement become a fragmented wave, reaching almost timidly across the graveyard. A wave of white, exhausting itself like surf. The whiteness was not exactly like flickers of light. It seemed almost like the absence of darkness. At the same time, it became light when it touched the broken point of a spirit fence, the hollow face of a grave. In my imagination, in the acceptance of a mind that was not in combat, it seemed that there was movement along the graves. The darkness was complete. North stood beside me, and all that could be seen of him was a smudge of paleness. White face, white hair. The blackbird stood 10 paces away. All I could see was his white hand raised and resting on the neck of the now invisible horse. I heard breathing. My own, the horse's, the blackbird's, and the panting breath of North. When the voices began, they were not so alarming as the wind. It was impossible to say when they began. They were faint. The mind accepted that they had been there all along. The voices were like the babble of a public market, or like the disjointed buzz and bustle of a crowded street. As they increased in volume, the imagination sought to place a face behind each voice, and the imagination was quelled. So many faces would fill the forest, obscure even the wind, the sky. Faces. Oriental faces. "Oh, Kim," the blackbird said. "No, man. Ah, no." The blackbird's voice trembled, but not with fear. His voice was alive with grief. "Oh, my God," he said. "They're blind. They are dead and they are blind." His voice sounded as if he were screaming inside, but when he spoke to North, it was in a low mutter. "I should kill you and let them have you," he said. "There's things man ought not to know. You just made me know one of those things." The voices grew louder. "I can't stand to hear it," the blackbird said, and he was talking to Kim. "Man, don't do this." "I reckon he can't help it," North said. There was something peculiar, something cruel in North's voice. It was a voice of fear, but more it was the voice of combat. The babble changed. At first it was impossible to say how the voices were modulating. It was only possible to recoil from the sounds of awful sorrow. The voices were intertwined, yet individually were as distinct as each thread of a spider web. The voices were like a tapestry of sound, and each thread was dyed in the colors of sorrow. Sound was white, thin red, like watered blood. The cries knit in the shroud of darkness. How can an insane man go crazy, I thought, and the voices began to wail. The wails spoke of every hunger that has ever tormented the human heart. Hunger for booze and food and sex. Hunger for some kind of God somewhere. Hunger for sleep and pretty things. And hunger for stars and being warm. Hunger for sunlight and kinfolk and laughing with friends. "If you're talking to Kim," North said to the blackbird, "and tell him I want to make a deal." "It isn't Kim," the blackbird said in a low voice that carried all the horror of a scream. "It's what Kim was when he was killing. The rest of him, all the rest of him's been eaten." The blackbird choked off his words. His white hand disappeared into darkness. Sounds of the zipper on his duffel bag, the muffled sounds of steel bumping steel. These said that the blackbird was armed. "Lawyer man," the blackbird said, "you better find yourself a ditch somewhere." I paused. Beside me, North hesitated, then moved. He grabbed at my arm just as I moved in the opposite direction. I pulled away from him, hit the deck, and rolled. The pitch of the wailing rose and blanketed the night. Flashes of luminescence were rushing from the interior of the forest. The graveyard was filled with dancing and erratic points of light. It was like being stunned, the brain crashing about in darts and lasers of light. I rolled downhill. There was no cover. A small mound of earth stopped my movement. A grave, perhaps. Most likely it was a rain-beaten pile of soil, a mound between graves. It had been piled by the grave robbers. "Try it out, baby," the blackbird said to North. "Let's see how good you really are." The blackbird chuckled. "You conniving fool. Thought to trick the bird up here in the dark with that swatty old 45? How'd you come to such a mess?" Blackbird's voice seemed here, there, moving in the darkness. The horse was also moving, but only its breath was audible. It moved silent-footed, the way war horses had been trained back in the 19th century. When the blackbird stopped speaking, I had the feeling he was himself a spirit. He could be standing 3 feet from me and I would not know. "Turn on your light," North said. "I can't figure what you're talking about." His voice was full of his lie. I searched for him in the darkness. Was it illusion? Madness? I could see the points of light, but they didn't illuminate. North and the blackbird were invisible. "You turn on your light," the blackbird chuckled. He was very close, within 8 or 10 paces. There was a slight rustle as he moved away. "Try not to get dead, lawyer man." The blackbird's voice diminished as he moved away. "You die around this here mess and you get stripped. What'll be left is what's holding that pistol." The .38 was in my hand. The old patterns were automatic. I had armed myself even while rolling for cover. "Ought we take him now?" the blackbird asked. "Or ought we sweat him that least little bit?" The blackbird was not speaking to me, but to the horse. "You got this wrong!" North's voice came from a different position. He was uphill and to the left. I was not confused about where to point my weapon, only confused about why it pointed at North. Then realization came among the scattering points of light. Gods of thunder. Valkyries. Cathedrals. Burials in the church. The sacrificial lamb. Sacrifice. "Brought us up here to kill us," the blackbird said to the horse. "Thought he could trade 2 for 1, maybe. Trade off his friends." The blackbird's voice became cruel. "Kim! Shut down your light show! Let it be blacker than black, and tell your boys to wash up! It's supper time!" The whiteness faded. The wails faded. Only the voice of the wind sang high above the totality of darkness. "Using my left hand to toss this," the blackbird said, and he was either talking to the horse or to Kim. "Using the brown hand, the Asiatic hand, to fling this here." His voice was covered by the huge thump of an explosion in the forest. Heat from the grenade flew red into the wet fir needles. The thump vibrated across the graveyard, and the explosion was as red as a furnace. Branches were seared, torn, and thrown. The smell of the explosive shoved across the graveyard like a tide. "Bag of grenades is a nice thing," Blackbird said. "Have a lot of fun with a bag of grenades." "Put the gun down," I said to North, and was moving even while I spoke. "If it's a mistake, then put the gun down." I rolled sideways, then inched downhill toward the forest. Another grenade exploded. Blackbird was not throwing them into the graveyard. The explosion thumped in the forest. "I got a little HE here," the Blackbird said. "Want to try some plastic?" It was a waiting game. The night was like the depths of a cave. High overhead, the wind seemed to be moving mountains of darkness toward the graveyard. Deep, impenetrable. The wind was an enormous carrion crow, a raven, spreading wings of darkness. When the plastic explosive flashed, it was sharp, white, brilliant. Blackbird had attached the plastic to a trunk of a large fir. The graveyard appeared as in a flash photograph, lighted to show North crouched 100 feet up the hill and among the graves. Blackbird invisible. The horse invisible. Somewhere in the forest. I chanced a shot with that pathetic little .38. North wheeled and emptied the magazine in my direction. We were both stunned by the light, our ears cracking with the slap of the explosion. Before North's last round crashed beside me, shattering the already broken spirit fence, the rush of the blasted fir was like an exclamation. The trees thumped, bounced, thumped again. North had lost none of his ability with that pistol. In the hands of most men, a .45 is not particularly dangerous. Not at 100 feet. It's like throwing huge stones. But North was good. His fire was not erratic. It was called searching fire, and it was statistical. He carefully placed the rounds to cover the area where he last saw me. There was the unmistakable sound of the pistol's slide. North had loaded another magazine. "Best to quit playing around," the Blackbird drawled to the horse. "The lawyer gonna get his fool self killed." I rolled farther, backed up, edged toward the forest. "Keep it shut," the Blackbird whispered to me. He was within a few feet and astride the horse. His whisper was covered by the wind. "Let one off in 2 minutes. Wait 2 minutes. Do it again." He passed me 2 grenades. "Gotta keep him out of the forest," he whispered. If North got into the forest, he need only wait for our flashlights as we tried to leave the graveyard, or wait for daylight to ambush us. "Got a little timer down there," the Blackbird said. "It all comes together in 6 minutes." He disappeared into the darkness. The horse was moving fast among the graves. Even that silent moving horse could not avoid some sound on that steep slope. A cruel and wonderful joy accompanied those grenades. They nestled in my hands like children. They were more beloved than any woman. The beautiful weight of the things, heavy as sexual urgency, promissory as good books, good whiskey. My God, I thought, this is what I am. This. No madness was so great that it could obscure the beauty of this. These sane and perfectly sculptured grenades. I loved the Blackbird. I loved him like I've never loved a woman. He was my comrade, my friend. He trusted me. Our lives were in each other's hands. I arched the first grenade back into the forest. It bounced from a tree, exploded in a small gully, a culvert, a stagnant pool, a hidden grave, something. Water and steam rose into the trees like a puff from the breath of hell. North's pistol exploded. 1 round. The muzzle flash was above me and now to the right. North was firing across the hill at some sound of the climbing horse. The bullet clacked as it hit the saddle or stirrup or pack. The horse screamed, and the scream rose in the wind like the voice of a frightened child. The horse sobbed, quieted. It was breathing in huge, sucking breaths. "Oh, man," the Blackbird said. "Now I'm gonna have to kill you twice." He was moving fast and away from the horse. "You better shoot," he yelled, "because the bird is going to hurt you." The blackbird was intentionally drawing fire. It made no sense, unless he was trying to keep North on the hill. Maybe the bird was trying to draw North's fire away from the horse. North emptied the magazine into the darkness, toward the blackbird's voice. I fired once, just above and behind the pistol flash. "Dead," the blackbird said. "North is deadums." There was the sound of North loading another magazine. I could not believe that I'd missed him. My combat sense said that I had not missed him. I waited for the heavy breathing of a wounded man. I waited for his desperate fire. Nothing. Maybe he was only nicked, was moving quickly for the forest. I searched, found a clod of wet soil and threw it to the right. Silence. Darkness. Wind. When I threw the second grenade, it flashed among the shrubbery to the right and at the edge of the forest. North fired 2 rounds of random fire. In throwing to the left, then to the right, I'd allowed him to bracket me. North was good. Nobody could deny that he was good. And he was apparently unwounded. He was as wired on combat as any of us. His fire was random, but his instincts were tuned. The bullet slapped within 2 or 3 feet of me. He was using a lot of ammunition. He must have come prepared to fight a war. The second grenade was expended. 2 minutes remained. Silence. Darkness. Wind. The wails of the spirits were abated, hushed. Yet the presence, or maybe the awful memory of Kim's bloody chest, the awful memory of the blackbird dripping his own blood into the wound, hovered above the graveyard. And the silence was momentous with subdued sighs, sobs, weeping. Oh, he was crazy. Oh, that blackbird was crazy. I loved how truly crazy he was. Because when the timer went off, the darkness became a shattered parenthesis for light. No sane man would be carrying grenades and fireworks. Grenades, maybe. Fireworks, no. Blackbird, both. I hit the deck as strings of firecrackers began to rattle like small arms fire. The wind dipped around them. The stink of black powder spread before the twinkling explosions. The wind layered it across the graves. The explosions looked like blasts from a congregation of rifles. There was a long, rapid fuse burning down there. It was a hot glow running a thin line of red through the darkness. Firecrackers popped around a nearly intact spirit fence that stood like skeletal legs. On the ornately carved pickets of the fence, 2 pinwheels began turning like a cartoon automobile hell-bent for nowhere. The pinwheels threw gay little twinkles of red. A comedy. A mouse show. Mickey. The fuse ran. A skyrocket rose, arced, pointed into the graveyard. "Hit him!" the blackbird yelled. "Hit him! Hit him! Hit him!" I twisted toward North. The rocket splattered, through fire and sprays, through red sparkles, white strokes across the graveyard. North was moving from a crouch. I snapped off a shot as he hit and rolled. "No," I muttered. "Not that! Not even you!" I was screaming at North. "You're better off in hell than doing what you've done!" North had dug into the cover of an excavated grave. A macabre foxhole. Behind me, the rattle died away, and the colors fell as the pinwheels sputtered and died. I took careful aim at the half-ridden figure of North. Fired. 2 shots remained in the .38. Red bloomed 100 feet above North. In the returning darkness, the fire seemed at first like a spotlight through stained glass windows. Then it became ordinary, like a flicker of residual napalm. A common railroad flare cast red light through the broken spirit fences. The blackbird had set those fireworks as a diversion in order to light that single flare. He waited somewhere behind the flare, invisible. The flare put the lower part of the graveyard in silhouette. North fired again. The horse emerged from the darkness, and its flank was slick as it limped down the hill. "Hit him!" the blackbird said. "Hit him! Hit him! Keep him pinned!" North fired. The muzzle blast was concealed, the explosion muffled. It sounded as if he had deliberately fired into the soil of the grave. Hit him. Keep him pinned. I aimed. Fired. North screamed. His pistol exploded again, firing into the grave. The horse stumbled, and now timed flickers of light began to appear at the edge of the forest. The horse nearly fell into an excavated grave. Blood flowed on the flank, was black in the red light. Too much blood. The horse staggered directly toward North. In silhouette, it seemed as dark and as huge as the apocalypse, and it closed on North at an awkward pace. Blood. Foam. The mouth dripped white. In red silhouette, a white hand and boot seemed riding directly on the horse's back. The blackbird was playing Indian tricks. He rode towards North, and he hung on the far side of the horse. North fired. He began to scream. And I have heard screams, and know them, and know their caliber. And something terrible was happening to North. His pistol sounded as if it had exploded. Soil packed the barrel. Soil plugging the barrel as he fired into the grave. How many times has this happened, I thought. I scrambled towards North with the pistol. How many times has the air been full of smoke and cordite and screams? And how much red is there in the world? Of fire? Of blood? How many times checking the corpses? Or shooting them? To be certain they are comfortably dead. The horse closed slowly on the screaming North. Blackbird slid to the ground, holding the reins. The eyes of the horse were wide and red in the light of the flare, and the horse carried its wound as it might carry saddlebags filled with lead. It tried to rear, stumbled, the great body nearly falling. It raised a front hoof, white stockinged, and kicked futilely at North's head. It gasped, shuddered. It lowered its head, took North's right forearm in its mouth, lifted. I heard the bone break. "Let it be," Blackbird said to the horse. He pulled the reins, pulled the horse backward. "Sweet baby, let it be." From the forest, like exhausting waves of surf, points of light scattered across the graveyard. The wind caused whispers as it blew around the spirit fences. North was a big man. He took a lot of killing. He was as tenacious as the wind above the forest. He half raised on his left arm, screamed, and his legs moved as he tried to push himself from the plundered grave. I leaned down, trying to turn him over. He was trying to help me. He pushed with his left hand, with his legs. I pulled, trying to turn him and find the wounds, but he was stuck in the face of an empty grave. His madness made it impossible for him to move. No wound was visible. Only a right arm bent at a wrong angle. A little blood where bone poked through the flesh. Rainwater in the grave was stagnant, smelled putrid, was stained with mud, but not with fresh blood. In the light of the flare, in the howl of the wind, the dancing points of light winked like distant small arms fire. Red and white. A red and white surf seemed blown into the graveyard on the voice of a red and white wind. "How did you know?" I asked the blackbird. He'd shrugged off his jacket, taken off his chambray shirt. "Give me your shirt," the blackbird said. "Forget that thing." He gestured at the screaming North. I shucked my jacket, my shirt, handed him the shirt. "Nicked an artery," the blackbird said. His voice was hollow with grief. "Got to stop it. It'll pump open a big hole." He tore my shirt into strips. "How did I know?" he grunted. "Kim told me. Of course, Kim could have been lying." The blackbird was putting a compress bandage on the horse. "Gotta get this fella to that Indian graveyard before he falls." His voice was low, his black torso visible only beneath flickers of red. "I can't leave him die in this place. Man, he was so light and fast. They'd take that away." In the red and white light, Blackbird's face was a small sculpture of grief. He worked rapidly. Gonna lose him. I'd give my half interest in hell for a sewing needle and some catgut. He turned toward North, and North's screams were choking. North's throat must be stripped raw with the screams. And suddenly, with a rush of fear for my own soul, I realized that I'd not really been hearing those screams. They were so common. That light show was too real, the Blackbird said. Maybe this piece of trash, and he pointed at North, made it real. Or maybe it really is real. That 45 was meant for us. If North had seen all this before, he knew there wasn't enough bullets in the world. Blackbird looked at North, at the open mouth that sent scream after scream across the graveyard. They were routine screams, common and ordinary screams, screams that in combat were less interesting than involuntary curses, or the wail of the wind over the lip of the jungle. I'll make you a deal, the Blackbird said to North. His voice was neutral, neither cruel nor kindly. You don't deserve it, but I'll make you a deal. You're the man who knows how to laugh, so laugh. You laugh, I'll pull you out of that hole. Horror lay somewhere in my mind. It was red like the flare, as steady as the hand of the wind. It was wide and large, back there somewhere. But in the front of my mind was cold pleasure. North's white face, mud-stained, stained by history, by combat, seemed to flatten as he clenched down on a scream. His face stared from a shallow grave that for him was as deep as an abandoned quarry. His face concentrated on what it had to do. The left hand brushed at the soil on the grave's edge. North's teeth were clenched, then open. His mouth was a black hollow in the red light. He smiled, lips white and thin and ghastly. A thin-lined and awful smile. Then chuckled like oily pebbles rattled in a tin can. He forced a laugh at history, combat, at us, at himself. The sound was thin, nearly weeping. Oh, man, the Blackbird said. That ain't no kind of laugh. He gently nudged the horse, the white hand like the guiding hand of a father. He fumbled for his flashlight. But you got tons of time to practice, he said. Assuming they leave you anything to laugh with. The small spot of Blackbird's flashlight was like a lightning bug intent on following a line. Blackbird found the trail. His light disappeared downhill. For a short while there was the heavy breathing, the near stumbles of the dying horse. And these were more important than the low returning screams. North's left hand brushed and clawed on the edge of the grave. Blackbird disappeared toward the Indian graveyard. I don't know why I stayed behind. Maybe it was a simple combat dictum of don't let a dead man kill you. The rule that says a man who's even a little bit alive can still react. Maybe I stayed because of owing. A man who had saved my life in other days now lay victim of his own betrayal. Worse, I may have stayed because my own death lay somewhere in the future, and I was afraid of those mighty, old, and powerful forces the Blackbird had talked about. There's all the time there is. All the time, the Blackbird had said. Maybe I stayed simply because time was scampering, like the white-gloved mouse hands on a watch. North was a portrait in red and white. My flashlight glowed on his staring eyes. Wind reached for the flare, turned its tip into a tiny furnace. The flare cast crisscrossed shadows as it illuminated the chaos of torn graves and broken spirit fences. North's white face, his white hair, were grotesqueries painted in red light. Breath panted shallowly in his mouth. He was no longer able to scream. The broken arm had to be causing enormous pain, but he was engrossed in something greater than pain. The panting face, pale eyebrows knitted in concentration, held not horror, but something worse. The face held the knowledge of horror that was about to arrive. The wind assumed its proper place and proportion. It began to carry the sounds of distant wails. The wails were thin, and they approached beyond the advancing flickers of white. Whiteness lay at the top of the graveyard, as concentrated as a snowstorm. It reached down the hill, obscuring emptied graves, flicking like sparkles from the carved tips of the spirit fences. The white seemed like an artist's field, like gessoed canvas on which could be painted the color of screams. "No man deserves this," I said to North. "Not even you. I'd help you if I could." Perhaps he heard. I would like to believe he heard. That even as his ghastly immortality descended, there was at least one voice that recognized him as having once been human. The wails rose, and now they were demonic. These were the wails of hunger, the wails of the blind, the weeping of hollow faces that once had worn eyes. No Gothic cathedral bearing the most awful gargoyles could stand uninvaded by the weeping that now advanced in the tumbling surf of white. North suffered a last burst of energy. His feet pounded, kicked. He raised on his right elbow, the broken arm askew. He pushed with his left hand. The grave held firm. The first tongues of whiteness lay at the grave's edge. The wails began to clamor, began to assume hollow and nearly skull-like faces. The first pinpoint of light touched North. He did not scream. I did. His face was startled. His eyes were wide circles of disbelief. A man sunk in the knowledge of horror, in the knowledge that he would be stripped of everything but hunger. And he was still startled. In the days and months during which the horror had approached, hours of sobriety and hours of drunkenness, nothing had prepared him for this. The points of light were feeding, but not on his body. I watched, and at first I thought the weeping in my soul was for North, for myself, for the blackbird. North's face went from one shock of revelation to another, as the carpet of white wrapped around him, wailing, 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 and each shock took him deeper into the horror of loss. No death by napalm or crucifixion or inquisition was so terrible as this immortality of hunger. My weeping increased, from heart to eyes. Sorrow, like a field of white, filled my mind, body, heart. Then there was a tug. It was like being nipped by a flea or an ant or an earwig. Fear unlike any I had ever known swelled around me, because the nip was not on the flesh. It was as if a memory had been bitten, some memory of pleasure, sunlight falling through leaves, or shadows and light across the face of a lover. Gone. I backed away, looked down at North. So this is how it was with him. His memories of beauty stripped away. The many times his eyes had looked to sea, or looked into the rolling banks of Puget Sound mist. Stripped. The calm majesty of the surrounding forest, even the memory of the eternal rain. Stripped. His face seemed collapsed, already removed from all humanity. Yet his mouth still sucked air. His lips were white. Death was due in moments. There was another tug. Horror was trying to move my legs, trying to make me dash crazily into the red-lined darkness, perhaps to trip and fall into a grave. Another memory gone. The memory of my daughter as an infant, laughing, creeping across the floor. Then the memory of street music tinkling above the heads of crowds in a market. North's body was dead. His jaw hung loose, and his eyes seemed like frozen discs that stared over the white waves of hell. A white horizon. The slack lips, the jutting tongue, remained motionless. But deep from what little remained of his spirit, his voice issued. It was a wail, thin at first, ascending, louder. The corpse was wailing North's blindness, his hunger, and the wail was a creature of white, a pinpoint, then a needle of white. Whiteness was beginning to spread. Flickers danced around me. The wail from North's mouth rose newborn toward the sky, searching, hunting, in pursuit. I fled then, running, but a cautious run behind the strong beam of the flashlight. Broken fences leaned, open graves were dark mouths. I fled the redness and the whiteness, following the flashlight beam into the safety of utter night. Behind me the white points of light ascended above the despoiled graves like the robes of some ancient sorcerer. As I entered the forest trail, the graveyard was a concatenation of wails. Spirits were ravishing the already ravished graves. The Indian graveyard lay as black as the blackbird's skin. It lay as strong as the blackbird's resolve. On this more level ground, trickles of water moved, and wet fir needles gave back pressure of moisture beneath my feet. I called to the blackbird as I entered the Indian graveyard. Behind me in the narrow river of sky above the trail, clouds of whiteness seemed washed here and there by the wind. The blackbird did not answer at first. I nearly switched off the flashlight. It made me a target. When the blackbird did answer, it was in a subdued voice. I made my way toward him, around the quiet graves enclosed by the oversized beds. He sounded sane. I was not, and for moments it seemed that the boiling white clouds behind me were clouds of insanity. The blackbird knelt beside the dark shape of the dead horse. Blood pooled on the carpet of fir needles. A large white slug was at the edge of the pool. Blackbird picked it up, looked at it, threw it into the darkness. There was grief in his voice, but for me the blood and carcass of the horse were comforts. In the middle of madness, at least the bullets had been real. Dead, the blackbird said. I didn't know whether he spoke of North or of the horse. Finished. My voice sounded the way voices sound after combat. Men ask questions, assure each other the perimeter is secured. Took it pretty hard, did he? It was bad, I said. Worse than he deserved. Nah, it wasn't, the blackbird said. I hope he's trussed up like a stuffed pig over a fire pit. He would have settled for that, I said, because it was worse. Well, well, the blackbird said. That's an elegant thing to say. You weren't there. Nope, the blackbird said, but I heard the ruckus. I turned off the flashlight to save the batteries. No cave was ever darker than that forest. In the darkness, the power of the graveyard was serene. A question came. Why such unbreachable power here when up the hill was only despoliation and fury? What kind of hell do Indians have? I was probably speaking to the blackbird, maybe to the graveyard. Depends on the Indians, the blackbird said. Booze, mostly, little tuberculosis, bad dreams. You know what I mean. Mostly they try not to think about it, the blackbird said. The aftermath of combat is always the same. The talk is short. There's no space for tears. What's a man supposed to do? Scream? Screaming doesn't work, because in combat you've already tried it. Sometimes the men scream in their sleep. New fellow one time? The blackbird chuckled, and he didn't sound so sane after all. Had to bury his horse, so he dug a hole. The blackbird was not laughing at his story. Maybe he was laughing at himself, at his memories. Only after he got the hole dug, the horse was stiffened up. Legs stuck out the hole. The chuckle was not exactly a chuckle, and it was not exactly a sob. I'd heard the sound before, but not for many years. No power in the world could have made me turn on my flashlight. Blackbird was dealing with grief. Blackbird could kill me so quickly I would not suspect I was being killed. So I went to a butcher shop, the blackbird said. Borrowed a meat saw. Cut the legs off, toss them in a grave. Horse fit just fine. We sat in darkness. Friends. Men who seemed in the business of saving each other's lives. Men who owed. At least that was true if the lives they owned still held enough memories not tinged in fire. "I'll help you dig," I said. "Help fold the legs before he stiffens." "I'd be obliged," the blackbird said. "We go get shovels come day. Have to hurry. Whoever finds North's gonna be yelling cop for 40 miles. I thought of law, of darkness, of history. Memories of a wet land. Memories of screams, parachutes, oriental faces, polished fragments of bone washing from the hills. The Buddha's smile. I would have to throw the .38 into a river. I thought of Miss Molly and hoped her father was well. Then I hoped he was dead. Then I discovered that I didn't like Miss Molly. Thoughts disarrayed. All of the nicey nice people, and I trusted no one but the blackbird, because the bird could play the game, but he did not order up the game, or purchase it, or applaud it. "You like being insane?" I asked the bird. "I don't like it," he said, "but I sure don't like the other." "Me too," I giggled. "You've got the sanity of insanity. I've got the law. I know a lot about Indians," the blackbird said, "and everything about horses." We folded the horse's legs, and we sat on wet fir needles and leaned our backs against the folded legs as rigor mortis set in. We sat safely in darkness, untouched even by the wind that battered the coast and hills and forest. For us, the darkness was not a curse. We sat waiting for the first touch of morning in the tops of the trees, and sitting, waiting for the rest of that night at least, we were safe from the shattering lights of a white and wailing world.
Primeval Into the Darkness was read by Michael Murphy. The Pool was written by Whitley Strieber. By Reason of Darkness was written by Jack Cady. Leszek Wojcik was the recording engineer. Production engineering was by Steven Erickson. Elisa Shokoff was the production coordinator. Primeval Into the Darkness was directed and produced by Karen Frohman. I'm Douglas Winter, the editor of Prime Evil.